Welcome to the 29th meeting of this year of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off their mobile phones, etc., because they can interfere with the sound. And apologies have been received from Alec Ferguson, and we welcome Jamie McGregor to the meeting as the substitute for Alex. Welcome, Jamie. Agenda item 1, subordinate legislation. This first item today is for the committee to consider a negative instrument as listed on the agenda. Members should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation. I refer members to the paper. Does anyone have any questions that they want to raise about the paper? No questions from members. I'd just like to ask the Cabinet Secretary, since he's here, if he will, in this negative instrument about Common Agriculture Policy Single Farm Payment and Support Scheme Amendment, it basically shows us that the rates of European modulation, go from a zero amount to a higher amount as we go through to the bigger income earners, and that you have changed the member state modulation so that it's a flatter curve. That means that in overall terms, there's a 9% modulation for the lowest paid, 14% for over 5,000 and similar right up to over 300,000. Is that just a continuation of the practice before?
Good morning. Yes, it is, Convener. Of course, we set these rates back in 2007, if my memory serves me correctly, and these are just a repeat of the rates that have been in place through the whole of the Rural Development Programme and the single farm payment regime we have in place at the moment. Yeah. And of course, the rate of modulation is largely dictated by the size of the Pillar 2 budget. So needless to say, whilst modulation has been replaced by flexibility under the new Common Agricultural Policy reforms, the extent to which we transfer from Pillar 1, which is direct support to farms, to Pillar 2, which is the Rural Development Regulation, will be dictated by the size of the Pillar 2 budget we get as part of the current budget negotiations.
So that sounds as though we could be strapped for cash once again in this case, but perhaps more so than last time.
Well, that's why I've said publicly at the moment that it's very, very unlikely we'll be transferring from Pillar 2 to Pillar 1. And it's very likely we will require a transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 because of the poor budget we have in Pillar 2. However, the extent to which we do that will be subject to probably a mini consultation, because that's the first decision we have to take under the new reforms, and that decision has to be taken before the end of this year, to what extent we'll transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2.
I hope members understand that it occurred to me that it would be useful to get that explanation. But there's no motion to annul, so I ask members of the committee wishes to make any recommendations in relation to the instrument. Nobody wished to make any recommendations? Right, thank you very much. We move on to agenda item 2, the draft budget scrutiny. And this looks at the budget for 2014-15 for the Scottish Government. I'm delighted that Richard Lochhead, who's already spoken, is here with us as the Cabinet Secretary. I welcome Richard and his officials. Jonathan Price, Director of Rural and Environment, Linda Rossborough, Director of Marine Scotland, and Colin Cook, the Deputy Director, is he here? Yes, he is, of Digital Strategy and Programmes. In the shadows there, but no doubt in the limelight very soon. So we're going to begin the questioning, and when we come to the points of these interests, the members will follow on with questions that we've arranged with them. So looking at the national performance framework, how is the performance of indicators relevant to the RAE budget taken into, how has it been taken into account in deciding the new overall draft budget for the Government of Scotland in 2014-15?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning again to the committee. I'm just taking a few seconds to compose myself and recover after being asked to discuss modulation with no notice at 9:30 a.m. in the morning. However, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to be here before you to discuss the budget. And you start off by asking what is a good big picture question is, as we look towards the overall performance of the Scottish Government, look at our performance indicators, how do we link that to our budget decisions as we move forward? And of course, the committee will recall that back in 2007, this was a new approach taken by the Scottish Government to have a national performance framework and then have that guide us in terms of the outcomes we want to achieve for Scotland in the coming years. So looking at the performance indicators, since you've asked the question, Convener, clearly there are some indicators where performance is improving in terms of my own portfolios, in terms of some of the waste statistics, etc. There are other performance indicators where it's just a case of maintaining existing performance, and there are some, of course, where performance is worsening. We have a number of environmental performance indicators, such as the abundance of terrestrial breeding birds, and also the number of fish stocks where the catch limit is consistent with scientific advice. So I clearly do pay attention to the performance indicators when looking at our budgets. We've unfortunately not had the opportunity, given the very tough financial situation we're in, to make big changes to our budgets. So clearly I'd like to devote a lot more resource to some of these budget headings that address some of the indicators where we have some concerns, but I simply don't have the budgets available to do that. Neither does the Scottish Government, due to the cuts, as you know, we're receiving at the moment from Westminster. However, saying that, it is important I do pay attention to the indicators. If you look at some of the indicators, of course, you have to understand the reasons why they're changing. So if there's a decline in the breeding of terrestrial birds, then we have to understand the reasons behind that and to what extent actually changing the budgets would influence it in the first place. So we have some species of bird populations in Scotland that are in decline. That is largely been put down to weather conditions, climate change, perhaps availability of food for the bird populations, particularly the seabird populations affected. So whilst I'm taking into account those performing indicators in terms of policy, so we now have a Marine Act, we're going to have marine protected areas. There's a big debate taking place in Scotland just now as to what extent marine protected areas should play a role in protecting bird populations. I'm engaging in that debate, particularly with our NGOs and the RSPB and others. In terms of the budgets themselves, Marine Scotland clearly have a big role to play in that. And over the last few years, Marine Scotland's budgets had to take into account the fact that we have a Marine Act now in Scotland. There's a lot of scientific work being undertaken to make sure we're underpinning where the MPAs are located, etc., by good scientific evidence. So I do take these things into account.
On your own budget, what do you think your best performance has been in terms of the performance indicators? Which part of the budget that you control? Is there any really outstanding items that we should tell the world about?
Okay, I'll try and take the next 5 hours up by just discussing all the various successes of my portfolios.
Lights.
Well, clearly, I have to look at the broad picture facing rural Scotland, and we have a number of sectors that are indeed improving. I'd like to think our budget allocations, government policy plays a role in that. We have a lot more resource going towards project aimed at reducing fish discards, trying to get sustainable fisheries into place. Clearly, Marine Scotland, as I said before, have played a big role in that. We've got a lot more trials now been undertaken in terms of discard reduction projects and selectivity for fish gear, etc. Standout budgets. Clearly, the food and drink budget we established a few years ago for the first time has, I believe, made a significant difference. We're seeing a food and drink revolution taking place in Scotland just now, not just in terms of exports overseas, which are breaking all records for food and drink, but also domestic consumption of our own larder in this country. And we are undertaking a lot of initiatives in terms of food policy, not just in terms of promoting Scotland's larder, where we're promoting schemes such as Think Local. We're trying to support local food projects around the country so people can have local food networks, so they can celebrate local food and drink in their own communities, etc., etc. These are proving to be very worthwhile projects. Also, food education, is another aspect that we are funding for the first time through our food and drink budgets. And again, these are relatively new budgets just established in the last few years, which I think are paying big dividends given the success of our food and drink industry in Scotland. The Climate Challenge Fund, of course, is also an innovative fund that was established a few years ago, which we've protected and we have maintained in the last couple of years despite the difficult budget situation. Again, engaging communities and reducing their own carbon footprints, I think has been a very successful road to go down. It's had cross-party support. And again, that would be a highlight. So I could talk for a long time, but there are 2 or 3 areas that are relatively new in the last few years, which I do feel are paying dividends.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder, good morning, Cabinet Secretary, if you might be able to highlight for us ways in which the link between the National Performance Framework, as it develops and is reviewed the next time as well, how the links might be strengthened between that and the budget so that that becomes as transparent as possible, because at the moment it's quite opaque in my view.
Yes, it is a learning process. As I said before, this is a new way of trying to be transparent and trying to link national performance to our budgets and how effective they are. Because we are transparent in that we publish the performance indicators, the public, Parliament can look at indicators, hold governments to account if clearly they're failing or there's a downward trend. Again, the performance indicators relate not just to budget decisions but policy as well. And if I were to take the worsening performance indicator over fish stocks where the catch limit is consistent with scientific advice, I'm told, for instance, that the current dispute over the mackerel stock, which is a well-documented international dispute just now, because that means our mackerel stock is not being fished within a management regime that's internationally agreed because of the dispute, then that becomes a worsening indicator. And the mackerel stock, I'm told, accounts for 40% of the indicator. So that's a policy issue. It's not necessarily changing a budget allocation. It's about ensuring that our policy of getting the international dispute resolved is important in that respect. But in the wider sense, I clearly am looking at how we build carbon reduction measures into agricultural policy, for instance, because I'm looking at the performance indicators in terms of Scotland's carbon footprint, in terms of emissions, in terms of the role agriculture plays in that. Also, we have the climate change targets. So in terms of our budgets within agriculture, in the last few years, we have devoted some resource to trying to engage all farms in Scotland in the Farming for a Better Climate initiative, for instance. So I do like to think the performance indicators do play a role. But I don't have a simple answer to questions as a learning process of how we can link directly the performance indicators to our budget decisions.
Okay, thank you. There are ways in which the link between the budget and the outcomes could be more transparent for us, because carrying over, it's the job of committees to try and see what's happening as a trend. And we often find it difficult to do so. Can you suggest ways in which we could do that more easily so that we can link one budget with the next?
Well, it strikes me you're highlighting, a good issue, and it would be very useful to have your views on this, because I am keen to be as transparent as possible in terms of linking back our budget decisions to national performance indicators. I've given some examples of how they are taken into account, and that's why we think they're important to have. However, we want this to be a style of government, not just for our administration, but forevermore, that all governments link their budget decisions to national performance. And if you have ideas of how that can be more transparent, better achieved, I've certainly got an open mind. Perhaps one thing we could look at, which I could give a commitment to look at, is how we do present the information in terms of our budget headings alongside the relevant indicators. There might be an opportunity to do that, and I'd be willing to take that idea away and come back to committee with some ideas for how that could be achieved.
Thanks very much. We turn to rural broadband issues. Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Whilst the evidence we received last week on rural broadband was actually quite positive, We were advised that achieving 95% superfast broadband coverage by 2018 would require the allocation of additional sums to the project. Do you accept that assertion? If so, can you indicate how much you think will be needed, and also from where that money might come?
Thank you. Well, it's heartening that we're now discussing at our sessions rural broadband, because a few years ago I don't think this was high enough up the agenda. And certainly from a rural development perspective, I've been very keen as Cabinet Secretary to push rural broadband much further up the agenda. The Scottish Government does not have responsibility for regulating broadband, as the committee will be aware. That's a reserved issue to the UK Government. However, compared to many other countries, we're quite far behind in terms of rural connectivity. So I very much welcome the fact that this is much higher up our agenda. And of course, the Scottish Government is very keen to step in with Scottish resources to try and ensure that we're doing all we can to connect our more remote and our rural communities to the 21st century. There's now evidence of people leaving the rural communities to live in urban areas, so rural depopulation, due to a lack of connectivity. So whilst we've had these additional conversations about people leaving rural communities because of lack of access to higher education or lack of access to affordable housing or employment, now there's an added factor of where there's not good connectivity in terms of digital connectivity, that can also lead to rural population. And some rural research I've seen in the last year or so has started to show some evidence of that. So that should concern us all. So that is why the Scottish Government is focusing on rural broadband, and within that we've got a community broadband fund as well, which you're clearly referring to. And again, that's to help those communities that really are far behind and need to take a big leap forward to find their own solutions. And there's some pioneer projects across the country, indeed including one in my own constituency at Glenlivet and Tomintoul, which are going to hopefully benefit from community broadband. In terms of the funding that's required to be made available, well, the Scottish Government has allocated overall across the whole of government £280 million, and that includes contributions in turn from local governments, also from the UK Government, European funds and from enterprise funds as well. So that amounts to £280 million. So there's very much a partnership approach here, and we've had further consequentials from the UK Government in recent months as well, which currently sit with the infrastructure budgets, not my own budget, but that may change. We're at draft budget stage just now. Hence, you may notice that the budget heading line actually goes down from 48.8 to 33.8. That is because the consequentials have not been added onto the 2014-15 draft budget as yet. But overall, there's actually an increase in the budget for rural broadband. I'm happy to bring in Colin here, who's actually our expert in digital broadband. So it's very handy that he's here, and he could perhaps comment on how we estimate what resources are actually required to address the gap in rural broadband.
If I can emerge from the shadows if I'm still in it. Yeah, I mean, I think in committee's evidence, our partners, our contractors, BT, on the Next Generation Step Change Fund expressed confidence that we would hit the target, and they based that on their experience in Cornwall and elsewhere. And I'd like to repeat that from my side of the table. I think we've got the team in place who have delivered the contract on time to date in terms of negotiating it to the agreed timetable. We've got huge and enthusiastic and ongoing support from local government. That's important both in terms of the money they've made available, but also some of the support they can provide in terms of dealing with planning issues and the like, which can sometimes delay these sorts of projects. And I think you saw, I mean, Gavin Stevenson was here talking about this in enthusiastic terms. So we're confident that we can hit the 95% objective by the end of 2017-18. Having said that, there will be regions of the country and there will be local authority areas that will be beneath that target on current projections, and that is why we're continuing to lobby and argue for more money. And the biggest issue, of course, remains across the Highlands and Islands, which I know Alex Patterson talked about last week, where we'll be probably somewhere in the low 80% kind of coverage by that time, and that's what we're lobbying for more resources to try and deal with.
If I can come back on that, when we talk about lobbying for more resources, are we talking about going to Europe and going to the UK government for additional resources? And what sort of additional resources are going to be required?
Well, I mean, there are two ways of going at this. There's either extending the current type of contract that we have with BT, and we'll be looking to do that where it makes sense, and there's also providing additional funding for Community Broadband Scotland so they can facilitate more communities. UK Chancellor announced that there was an additional £250 million being made available across the UK for broadband over the next few years, and we're lobbying as part of that to make sure that Scotland gets its fair share. Our Cabinet Secretary, the Deputy First Minister, making the case that Scotland needs to be included in that. And yes, we are also looking, and local government is supporting this, to try and lever future European funds for an investment in rural broadband. There is an ERDF contribution to the current step change project of around about £20 million, and we are looking to try and increase that in future.
Thank you.
Just in terms of the promise, the suggestions by BT that there'll be 85% of premises covered by the end of 2015-16 and 95% by the end of 2017-18. Is it a possibility that there's a map showing which areas will not be covered?
Yes, there is a map. There's a high-level map that will be published on our website within the next 2 weeks. I think the committee covered this last week. There is a sort of last checking process, if I can call it that, that's being taken place at the moment and will carry on for the next couple of months. But when we get to January and we've got the basis of the delivery schedule agreed with BT, we're going to be extremely open about this, and on our Digital Scotland website, on the Scottish Government pages, you'll be able to put your postcode into a checker, and it will tell you when, under the current plan, you're likely to get access to next generation broadband. So we're going to be completely open once we've got data that we are, totally reliable in that sense.
Nigel Donn.
Thank you, Convener. I'm just wondering if I could go past what's currently being talked about. Forgive me, because it's not this year's budget, but we would expect to get mains electricity to every household in Scotland. At what point are we going to make the step change that says conceptually that everybody really should have access to broadband? At what point is somebody going to think about how we close the gap between the 90 whatever percent it is and 100%, or close enough to 100% that it's normal?
Well, one of the reasons why we were keen on the Community Broadband Scotland approach is to offer a way to tailor solutions to those communities who may not be covered by the wider contracts. And we have begun that process with the budget that's in place. There's a number of pioneer projects. I think there's a project that's been funded in Apple Cross, and there's various others, one of which I referred to earlier on as well. Clearly, they will be looking at satellite solutions or other kinds of solutions. So there is a requirement to plug that a further gap. We've got a gap at the moment that Scotland suffers from because of past policies, largely has to be at UK level, and we're trying to plug that gap through this new approach and additional resource. But yes, there's this other remaining gap, which is those parts of Scotland that will even benefit from that because of their specific circumstances. So that's why Community Broadband Scotland was created, to try and plug that specific gap. And clearly, as a government, we're very keen to hope. We're keen for that to be a success, and we'll have to build upon it if it is successful to make sure we can get the whole of Scotland covered. We don't, we want the whole of Scotland a level playing field. This is not just about people having the same rights as everyone else in Scotland, but it's also about creating jobs and economic benefit, and will help our rural economy greatly. So that's why it's really important.
Cabinet Secretary, last week in oral evidence, the committee alluded to the fact that the £5 million for Community Broadband Scotland is a maximum allowed under EU state aid rules. Can you tell us what your understanding of this is?
Well, I'll bring Colin in a second, but my understanding of that particular point is that there's not necessarily a limit on what can go into Community Broadband Scotland, but there is a limit in how many times the same community can be funded from different funds under state aid rules. So, on the one hand, we've got the large contract which has been rolled out across, for instance, the Highlands and Islands. So if a community is going to benefit from that contract, it could not also benefit from Community Broadband Scotland. So I think that's my understanding. I'll just ask Colin to confirm that.
Yeah. Yes, that's absolutely the case.
I think that's the case then.
I mean, Community Broadband Scotland is a vehicle for facilitating community action. We haven't sought an umbrella state aid notification or agreement for its action, so we approach state aid issues on a case-by-case basis. And these projects are typically relatively small in financial terms. They're typically sort of £20,000 to £80,000 support. So we can continue to do that. I'm not actually sure where the notion of that cap came up, because, as I say, we go on a case-by-case basis for state aid clearance where we need it.
Well, I'd like to pursue this a little further, because when you talk about a community, let's assume, as I can think in my own constituency, of fibre passing through Milton of Kildare, and there are people about 3 miles up the hill living in Lamington who are asking the question, you know, are we the same community, or is there a recognition that there's no way that they're going to get a signal through the existing exchanges and so on, and will therefore need to try and look at Community Broadband Scotland situation? Is that going to allow you to define community much more specifically, or what?
We've just appointed a manager of Community Broadband Scotland, and he's going to be looking at all these issues. It may be worthwhile, you know, inviting him to appear before the committee at some point if you want to discuss this further. But I don't know, I mean, Colin, do you want to come in at that point? Or?
Well, I mean, it's almost trite to say it, but I think in a sense, because Community Broadband Scotland is about facilitating community action, and then the community really defines itself in that sense. What I think is important in this regard, and it refers to the answer I gave earlier, is from January, when we're able to issue all the information we have about who is going to get what and when you're likely to get access to the fibre project, and not all communities realistically are going to get access to a fibre to the Cabinet project, you will at that stage know whether you're in the current plans in the 95% or in the 5%. And at that point, I think it's the time when communities can make decisions about the approach they want to take. Now, there will, of course, be a sort of grey area where, with more money or extensions or improvements of technology, that fibre may be extended to 96%, 97%. But I think we'll be able to have that debate with communities from January.
That's very helpful. On another point separately, I understand that SSE are a major provider of broadband across the country via their pylon lines. Is there any way that that is included in the overall potential for people who at the present time have mixed views about pylons, and they might be sweetened up considerably if they thought they could get access to broadband?
Well, again, we're exploring all innovative ways to try and extend broadband across the country, and the colleagues in the infrastructure portfolio are in regular discussions, as you can imagine, with all the power companies over how we can use their assets, not just for broadband but for mobile phone reception as well, and there's various discussions taking place at the moment. Yeah. I'd be happy to come back to you on that specific points.
Be very helpful. I think it's quite an interesting one to a number of communities that are close to pylon lines. Thank you. Move on to climate change in RPP2. Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned the Farming for a Better Climate earlier. Now, the draft budget allocates 0.3 million for 2014-15 and 0.3 million for 2015-16 to support the Farming for a Better Climate programme. RPP2 attributes the Farming for a Better Climate programme policy to emissions abatement of 62 kilotonnes of CO2 equivalent for 2014 and 75 kilotonnes of CO2 equivalent for 2015. Are you confident that these emission abatement levels can be achieved with the funding made available to support the programme?
Well, I am very confident that we're certainly going to go in the right direction and make progress, and I think the most recent data shows that agriculture emissions are very much going in the right direction, and I'm happy to follow that up after this meeting in writing to give you more detail about the actual data and statistics. In terms of the contribution of agriculture, quite clearly we are tackling this on 2 or 3 levels. Firstly, there is the advisory services that we are funding in Scotland at the moment to help every farm business understand the benefits of changing their fertiliser management, of changing their energy profile, how they manage their livestock can influence, as we all know, emissions as well. That plays a very crucial role, particularly in the dairy sector, and therefore that advisory level of activity is very, very important, because there's actually benefits for a farm to adopt some of this low carbon practice, because they'll save money and become much more efficient. Secondly, there's the Farming for a Better Climate programme, which partly involves advisory, but also we have 4 climate change farms, demonstration farms in Scotland, and that is building on the monitor farms concept that we established a few years ago. Again, I think one of the farmers perhaps spoke to the committee recently from one of the climate change farms. So that sharing best practice, setting an example, having exemplars in the industry is a very good approach as well. Thirdly, there is the Common Agricultural Policy reforms that are taking place just now, and the whole approach of greening the CAP. And as the committee will be aware, indeed just as recently as last week's debate in Parliament, I've said before that I think we should be taking steps to ensure that every single farm in Scotland becomes more greener. And part of that for me includes reducing farming's carbon footprint. It's about a whole range of green issues, but also in my book it's about reducing the carbon footprint of farming. I was very frustrated during the negotiations over CAP reform that we couldn't build that in more explicitly into the greening measures. However, we are looking at how we can use some of the measures that are available under greening to introduce carbon reduction measures. Perhaps how we've got the ability to have equivalence measures over those that are on the table. If farmers don't want to adopt what's on the table from Europe, we can show that we have alternative measures that are equivalent, so that they can show their qualifying for the greening payments. So we're looking to see whether any carbon reduction measures would qualify under equivalence. So I'm confident that we are going to change the profile of Scottish agriculture, and as I said before, the data shows we are going in the right direction.
Thank you. You mentioned your frustrations with regard to the greening measures. Could you perhaps expand on that a little with regard to how the CAP budget negotiations have impacted on this budget?
Well, there's 2 points to make there, I guess. Firstly is the frustration over what I was referring to there is the fact that there's a whole debate over greening CAP to justify the Common Agricultural Policy to the public, to justify the public expenditure. And I was arguing within Europe and with the UK, but of course our Secretary of State for the UK at the moment doesn't believe that climate change is a problem and thinks actually it's quite a positive thing, so it's quite difficult sometimes to have these conversations. But I was arguing that the Common Agricultural Policy, in terms of being greened, should be looking at reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture across Europe, and that was a definition of green. It's about biodiversity and other issues, yes, but and water quality, but it's also about reducing the carbon footprint. Unfortunately, none of the greening measures that came forward under greening, which, as you know, accounts for 30% of the budget, relate essentially to carbon reduction. There are some issues around permanent grass, which you could argue is a way of storing carbon, and therefore it does relate to carbon, but it's not explicitly about carbon reduction. And I was disappointed with that. I thought we should have been adopting some carbon reduction measures as part of our greening measures to green the whole of the CAP. So we'll just have to look at what we can do here in Scotland. In terms of the overall impact of the budget negotiations on our budgets here in Scotland, well, clearly there is a significant impact because if we look particularly at Pillar 2, which is the funding that is important for the Rural Development Programme and wider rural development measures, clearly I am going to be having to take decisions in a budget that is hundreds of millions less than what it could have otherwise been. And other countries are sitting there with much easier budget decisions to take because they've got much bigger budgets for rural development. So I am being asked questions by your committee today about how we are responding to performance indicators. Many of the answers to those questions lie within the Rural Development Programme, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of agriculture's role in protecting bird populations, etc., etc. Yet the budgets I have available under rural development are much smaller than other countries have. Therefore, I've got less ability, perhaps, to respond to some of these challenges than some other countries have. So, whilst other countries, indeed 16 of them, negotiated an uplift in their Pillar 2 budgets, the UK Government decided not to ask for an uplift in their Pillar 2 budget. So Scotland went into these negotiations with the lowest Pillar 2 allocation in the whole of Europe, and we've come out the negotiations with the lowest Pillar 2 allocations in the whole of Europe, costing rural communities hundreds of millions of pounds between now and 2020. And of course, that's not even taking into account the impact of the Pillar 1 budget, the direct payments to farms, which of course it looks like we've also now come out with the lowest payments in the whole of Europe as well, to the cost of at least potentially €1 billion between now and 2020 for just the Pillar 1 budget, never mind the Pillar 2 budgets we've just been discussing.
Thank you. Claudia Beamish on this point.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, could I take you back to the Farming for a Better Climate? And as you highlighted, we had Ross Payton from Tor Farm in my region as one of the, I think is it a climate focus farm it's called now, or I'm losing track, but which was very, very interesting for the committee, and I hope for the wider agricultural community. I'm wondering the degree to which you think within this budget, which has got that focus, that good practice will be enough, or whether you see it as necessary to have more, perhaps robust regulation about how things will happen in our farming community in the future.
It's a good question, because again it comes down to whether or not the budget level is the relevant factor here in changing the carbon profile of agriculture in Scotland. Whilst I'm keen to ensure we do allocate budgets towards the advisory services and the Farming for a Better Climate initiative, and also to support our climate change focus farms, just to give them their name, the question we do have to address is to what extent, regulation or the Common Agricultural Policy, compliance conditions, etc., play a role in this. And in return for public support, it's only right that agriculture in Scotland should, be taking steps to safeguard our environment and reduce our carbon footprint. And therefore, I will be looking at what the possibilities are as part of the CAP reform. And as part, as I said before, of what equivalence measures we might want to bring forward in Scotland as part of the greening measures within the new Common Agricultural Policy. So, looking at how we have all farms engaged in using less nitrogen fertiliser, for instance, is one clear way you can reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture. And we have targets of how to do that at the moment in terms of targets. But there is a debate of whether those targets should be backed by regulation to make sure we achieve the targets. So we are looking at these issues.
Okay, we're looking at carry on about EU support at the moment just now. Jim Hume.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, just moving on to EU support and related services. Of course, the new CAP isn't going to be in place for 1st of January 2014, and the Scottish Government have made some transitional arrangements. Of course, that's perhaps resulted in less rural development measures. Is the Scottish Government in 2014 actually going to be making a saving to themselves on the rural development budget spending?
Thank you for that question. Clearly, we are at the moment having to budget for circumstances we can't quite predict. So I have said that due to the gap here between the existing rural development programme stopping and the new one beginning, that I want to see certain schemes continuing, and we will use domestic funding for those schemes. And that includes woodland grants, less favoured area schemes, support for new entrants. And we are currently considering what else we are able to fund to plug that gap. under the proposals from Europe at the moment, we are of course allowed to plug the gap for those issues I've just mentioned, but we are not allowed to continue support for food and drink budgets, for instance, or indeed LEADER, I understand as well. So the budget at the moment continues the budget lines for those areas on the assumption that if we cannot use European funds, we'll have to use domestic funds in some shape or form to support these kinds of areas. So that's why the budget lines are not being reduced, just because the measures that we currently fund with those budget lines are not allowed for the transition year, because we recognise that we have to A, argue with Europe to allow us to continue those programmes, and B, look for alternative ways of supporting those communities that might lose out if we can't use the Rural Development Programme or equivalent measures.
Sorry, just to clarify that, I appreciate the complexities of it. So it's really just a case, will the government, your own government, actually be able to be putting more in than last year, or less in than last year overall from their own budget, not the EU part, of course? Or is that...
Well, firstly, we won't make a saving because, if anything, we will we'll be using additional resource because we'll have no European funding.
Yes.
So if we want to even remotely come anywhere near the same level of support for certain projects, we'll have to add in more domestic funding.
No, that's clear. That clarifies that very point. Oh, sorry,
Are we
apologies.
supplementary in that then?
Thank you, Kabira, for indulging me. A layman's question, Cabinet Secretary. When you're talking about plugging the gap in these circumstances, are you able to recoup those funds retrospectively? Do you get them back from the EU eventually, or is that simply Scottish Government money that has to be found from somewhere to plug the gap and that's it gone?
It'll just be Scottish Government money that we have to use, and clearly we do that in any case, but we're usually getting part of the funding from Europe and part of the funding from the domestic budget. But what we're having to do is at least keep these areas supported financially through our own domestic budgets. However, in terms of LFAS payment, which is clearly the biggest payment, the way the years work in, and when you claim the European money back, we can smoothly use European funding for that. So I don't want to mislead the committee by saying that's purely going to be domestic money for that year, because the year you claim the money back from Europe compared to when you're paying it out to your farmers, there's enough flexibility to allow us to continue LFAS through the gap year. So that will, I guess, in the big picture, still benefit from the European funding. But the other areas I was discussing, we will have to plug the gap from domestic funds, I guess, wholly.
Okay. Thank you, that's helpful.
No, thanks very much, Convener. I think that was quite a useful question as well. Just exploring deeper into the EU support and related services budget, there's a business development budget line which increases by 4.1 million in 14-15. That's explained in the text as reflecting the pressure that may arise from less EU funding for SRDP, which is fine. But in 2015-16, there's a further £25 million increase. I just wonder what funding that would be meant to be spent on.
Okay. Well, to answer your first point, yes, that is an example where we're budgeting in the expectation we'll require more domestic resource to meet some of these pressures. So there's an increase in that budget. In terms of the £25 million budget, that is due to the financial transaction ability we now have through the UK government's financial transaction policy, which is effectively loans, and therefore I have bid for part of that in my portfolio. We've not decided how to use it yet. So this is a new mechanism made available by the UK government, part of which we have the ability to use in Scotland, and I've bid for that for my own portfolios. It's for around about £30 million. The net impact, the budget heading you see, is a plus £25 million. And that £30 million within the budget is sitting in the budget there effectively at the moment, because I've bid for it. It will be the ability to loan to certain sectors. We've not taken a decision yet how to use it.
Sorry, that sounds quite through the chair, the convener. Sorry, don't want to call you an inanimate object, but Sorry, that sounds quite interesting. Is that, and I realise you don't have the exact detail upon that, is that something like what might be called soft loans for helping enterprises in the rural environment within your portfolio? Or is there any early thoughts of what you may use for that on the ground?
Well, it could be used for a variety of issues. Clearly, we have to be very careful how we intervene in any particular sector with that, but it is certainly loans and it's not a grant. So just to make that point clear, and therefore, be that in terms of the food industry or be that within fisheries, we will have the ability to intervene where we feel there's an intervention required for a reasonable resource to help a sector adapt or whatever. So, you know, because it's early stages at the moment, I just had to bid for the money, because clearly I can look across some of my portfolios and see a need for this, but how we use it and when we use it is still up in the air at the moment.
That's fine, thanks. Thank you.
We'll go back to zero waste just now, please. Dick Lyle. Thank you.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. This morning you spoke about your performance indicators and what your successes have been, and I have to say I think one of the successes you've had since 2007 has been improvement in waste recycling. But one thing that does concern me in the budget, and it's a point which is described as a technical adjustment. The funding for zero waste has been reduced from 26.4 million to 23 million. This is quite an innovative terminology, technical adjustment. I always thought it was a cut. So can you give me the reason for this technical adjustment and whether you're confident in the budget of 23 million for 2014-15 sufficient to support the delivery of Scotland's zero waste plan, the plan that I think that you yourself have been the major driver behind?
Thank you. Yes. Well, firstly, I welcome your comments on our zero waste policy. I do believe it's making a genuine difference. It's a very ambitious policy which is setting a much higher standard. Indeed, other countries now are looking to do what Scotland's doing in terms of waste regulations, in terms of our desire now to look at how the whole concept of the circular economy can benefit Scotland. And I've got great expectation of what this can deliver for Scotland's economy as well as environmental footprint in the years ahead. So it's very much a medium to long-term path, but now we're on that path that's already paying dividends. And as you know, I've commissioned a feasibility study into deposit and return schemes for Scotland, and we're introducing a levy for carrier bags as well. So there's a number of measures in the pipeline which I think are going to help Scotland greatly. In terms of the budgets, many of those measures are delivered through Zero Waste Scotland and that programme for us, and their budget is remaining flat. So £23 million from that budget goes to Zero Waste Scotland, and that will continue to be the case. The reason for the change is a technical matter. It's taking the £3.4 million and having a corresponding increase in the natural assets and flooding line, where it's much more relevant to. So we've simply taken it from zero waste and put it into the natural assets and flooding line, because that's really where it belongs, and we just thought it made more sense. So it's gone down in one budget, not in another budget.
So it's commonly known as shifting it.
Shifting it, or
yes.
Technical adjustment, as we like to say.
Technical adjustment. I thought that was really innovative.
Language.
Can I one small? I mean, you touched on the fact of, and I agree. The amount of waste that we have in carrier bags. You get into, you know, my wife makes the point now of taking her own bags with us, and all the shops you go into, it amazes me how many, you know, you get one item and they say, you know, do you want a bag? And I take great delight in saying no. I want to save the planet. Do we know how much? Do you know how much we're going to raise from the levy on bags, and where that money would go?
Well, a central part of the regime is that the money will go to environmental causes, and our bigger retailers will have to publish the details of where the funding goes to be transparent. And that is, I think, the right way to go forwards, and happens successfully in other countries, that model. So there's clearly a win-win situation here, because it will raise some funds, a few £1 million per year for environmental causes. Clearly, the more that people reuse their existing bags, the less bags they'll be buying, the less money will be raised over time for environmental causes, but that will be a sign of success as time goes on. I'll happily send you the figures. There's a whole grid of estimated figures over the coming years of what could potentially be raised for environmental causes.
Thank you very much. Jane Baxter.
Morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to ask some questions about food and drink, and you made some reference to that in your opening comments. And it's very heartening to see the progress and the achievements that are being made in the food and drink sector. But I'm interested in local food initiatives and how our budgets can be used to support local food initiatives, and that would include projects like the Think Local project. But I'm also interested in, you mentioned the circular economy in your answer to the last question, so it's about shorter supply chains. How are we going to develop and support those sorts of approaches, moving away from project-based activity to changing the way that the sector works? Is there any scope to look at those sorts of issues?
It's a very good topic, because it's something I'm very, very interested in. And again, I'm proud of the fact that we have taken some measures over the last even just 2 years, which have never been taken before, in terms of certain funding streams we've created out of the food and drink budget line. And Think Local is one example you have given, and that is about supporting local food events and initiatives whereby there are, by definition, shorter supply chains, and encouraging people to eat more of the food from their own doorstep. And we are also looking at some industry initiatives as well. I recently visited a food business. It may have actually been in my colleague Angus MacDonald's constituency. You remember that? Yes. And we were discussing with the management, who make ready meals for Marks and Spencer's, that where the ingredients come from. And we had a conversation, and it was clear to me that, as well as visiting that company, I visited lots of other companies in the last couple of years, that if we can urge our manufacturers to source more of the ingredients locally, it clearly is an economic benefit for local businesses. So we're funding now the the Scottish Organisation of Agricultural, SOS, I always get their acronym mixed up, the SAOS, the Scottish Agricultural Organisation Society, to look at this, of how we can encourage food manufacturers to source local, because quite often it's something they'd happily do. So you may buy a salad, prepared salad that ends up on the supermarket shelf, but I want the tatties to be from Scotland, I want the onions to be from Scotland, I want the carrots to be from Scotland, etc., etc., etc. And there's, I think, an untapped potential there. So we are investing in these sort of initiatives. If you're asking me if we're investing enough, well, clearly I'd like to turn around in the future and have much bigger budgets available for those, because I think there's really big dividends to be captured for the Scottish economy and for our food and drink sector, and for local food as well.
That leads us very nicely into my next question, because there is quite a lot of funding going into the food and drink sector. Do you think there'll come a point at which the sort of cost-benefit analysis indicates that it could continue to develop with less funding, or can you justify continuing to increase the funding on a sort of never-ending basis?
Well, I think in the foreseeable future, given the success of our food and drink industry in Scotland, and I'm utterly convinced we're only scratching the surface, then we should actually continue to invest. And if we can find the opportunity to increase our investment, I am visiting companies all the time whose order books are going through the roof. Now there's an increase in the cost of raw materials. It doesn't necessarily mean their profits are always going through the roof, but the volume of sales are going through the roof. And in many cases, the profits are going through the roof as well, especially in the whisky industry. However, we are still scratching the surface. Therefore, I think we've got to seize the moment for the food and drink industry in Scotland. And the next few years will just be as crucial as the past few years in terms of continuing to invest. And that's why I'm keen to continue to use the next Rural Development Programme to support food businesses developing and expanding in Scotland, as well as this budget line here that you're looking at just now, the food and drink industry budget line. The final point is that in terms of overall budget decisions, it's becoming increasingly clear to me that our food policy will require to be refreshed, and we want to continue the good things, but we might want to find new dimensions to it. So food is not just about what we produce, it's about what we eat. And therefore food policy is about industry, it's about businesses being successful and developing, yes, but it's also about other things in society. So therefore, in terms of food budget headings in the future, I think, I'd like to see them increased.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Moving on to the subject of research, we have our own Don here, Nigel Don.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I guess the first thing to note actually on the research budget is I'm very pleased to see that it's more or less stood still, because it would be a relatively soft budget to have a go at if needs must. I note, however, the Level 4 commentary suggests that the small reduction has been delivered through a combination of efficiency savings, completion of specific work and support from Remain research providers through alternative sources of funding. And I'm just wondering whether the Cabinet Secretary can expand on what alternative sources of funding might be available, please.
Well, as the member will be aware, we're very lucky with our research institutions in Scotland at the moment, who are in virtually every case building up an international reputation for excellence. That reputation therefore attracts funding from the private sector, from outside of Scotland, for their good work. And when I meet the research providers in Scotland, I'm always fascinated by the great stories I'm hearing about the new contracts they've won for, it could be animal health issues, or it could be climate change issues, or whatever. We're very, very lucky in terms of the expertise we have. However, the more they can attract in terms of external funding, clearly the less reliant they are on public funding. So whilst there's certainly a case for public funding, and I've always defended it and I've always protected it, and over the last few years, despite the tough budget decisions we've had to take, generally speaking, there's been a flat budget for research providers in Scotland. Have not had to suffer some of the cuts that other agencies or other sectors have had to cut. So I've done my best to protect research budgets. So what this refers to is just that very point, is that we, however, do expect our research providers to continue to explore external sources of funding, and they are very, very good at that. And of course, they always make the point to government that if it wasn't for our funding, that wouldn't attract the external funding to match it or to establish the programmes in the first place, that therefore or thereafter attracting external funding. So we are protecting the budgets. There's a very small decrease, and yes, we do expect research providers to continue to source external funding.
Which actually just eloquently puts the dilemma in these things, that you have to support these institutions to be excellent, because they have to be truly excellent if other people are going to bring their money there. And if at any point you allow that excellence to disappear, then actually the other funding goes with it, which applies not just to these kind of institutions, but also, of course, to our universities. Yeah, thank you.
Again, I agree with that, and that's why I did go out my way to protect the research providers' budgets over the last few years of difficult budget negotiations, and irrespective of the cuts we've been getting from the UK government to the Scottish Bloc. And I will do my best to protect those budgets, but I don't want any institution, be them our fantastic research providers or any other institution, to rest on their laurels. They have to have a commercial dimension to what they're doing, and we want as much external funding attracted to Scotland as possible. And I think from our budgets of, you've got the figures in front of you of £56.7 million, £55.7 million 2014-15. That has attracted in the past, I think, around 20 odd million pounds of £23 million of external funding. So as you can see, every pound we put in attracts external funding.
Very good. Claudia Beamish, a supplementary on that.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, it's a brief supplementary, just reassurance on the issue of efficiency savings, which I would find a bit perplexing in terms of research and analysis about how those could be made. Could you shed any light on that?
Well, in terms of the research providers, yes. Well, again, we have clearly been asking our research providers to find efficiency savings, because even though we are trying to protect the budgets, we're not in a position to give increased budgets. We have to, and no doubt their costs are increasing at the same time, and they have to attract the best staff, so they have to ensure they're being as efficient as possible with the budgets they do have. In the past, we've worked with the research providers to work better together, and as you know, we've had some mergers. So there are successful examples of efficiency savings that I don't believe have compromised the research work undertaken with institutions, and I don't think there's any evidence of that. So I think our research providers are continuing to go from strength to strength. There's been some mergers, and there's some closer working together to avoid duplication, which is more efficient, and I think hopefully we're still in a good place.
And would that be within Scottish Government as well, in terms of efficiency savings?
Well, across Scottish Government, we've undertaken massive efficiency savings, and you just have to look at the Scottish Government's administration budget and how that's been dramatically cut over the last few years, just to see how efficient our own staff and our own portfolios have had to become. And you know, I think it's fair to say that our own colleagues have taken more than their fair share of efficiency savings.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, when I've spoken to research providers, the frustration they've expressed isn't with funding from government, but with the extent to which their work is sometimes promoted by government, not the Scottish Government, but the UK Government through DEFRA, a frustration that the good work that's done in Scotland isn't always pushed across the European Union, which in turn could lead to external funding. Is that a frustration you've had expressed to you also?
Well, there's no doubt that our research providers are giving a lot more attention to European sources of funding, because we have an international reputation, and you know, our research providers want to capitalise on that by attracting European funding. Clearly, there have been some budget issues south of the border, and I've had raised with me by some of our own institutions the impact of some of the cuts and the concern that's causing from the research budgets south of the border, because many of those, of course, are UK budgets, i.e. they come to UK institutions right across the UK, not just south of the border. So our institutions suffer from cuts from down south. Therefore, there's very much an incentive for our research providers not only to tell their own government how important public funding is, but to hopefully source external funding from elsewhere in Europe. So that's certainly an issue. Not really much more I can add to that, not being a research provider.
On to marine and fisheries now. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, could I draw your attention to the Scottish draft budget? I think it's page 98, where I quote, it says that the need for marine expertise and capability is growing and will continue to grow with the development of renewable energy and ever-increasing international obligations and requirements. And also within the, on the next page, 2014-15 and 2015-16, the last bullet point, which says we will, and I quote again, sustain our science base to provide robust evidence in support of policy developments and delivery. Obviously, at this stage, with the complexities of the development interests and the, how those fit with the marine protected areas, which you've already highlighted in your earlier remarks, I'm curious to know why, as I understand it, the Marine Scotland's funding is declining from 49 million in 2013-14 to 47.9 million in 2015-16. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, again, I very much recognise the additional pressures facing Marine Scotland, and we have, again, in the last few years, in the context of cuts across government, managed, I believe, to largely protect the Marine Scotland budget and indeed increase it at times. However, there have been efficiency savings undertaken by Marine Scotland at the same time. In terms of the small budget cut that you refer to, which works out at 1.2%, There was a transfer in there of £400,000 which simply went in from the Marine Scotland budget into the Scottish Government Central Administration budget for IT costs, because they're going to pick up the IT costs. So there's just a transfer from one budget heading to another accounts for £400,000 of that figure. And also there's going to be a further reduction of £1 million delivered by reducing administration and operational costs and trying to increase receipts at the same time. So again, it's just a case of efficiency savings. However, it's worth saying that at this time, because of the significant responsibilities Marine Scotland have, as you've quite rightly highlighted, with offshore renewables, with the marine protected areas and ongoing fishery science, they are at the moment actually recruiting more scientists and going to great efforts to make sure we're attracting good talent into Marine Scotland. So I don't want this committee having the impression that there's some sort of decline of the expertise in Marine Scotland because of efficiency saving. They're actually recruiting at the moment for more talent to come into the service. But of course, one issue we always wrestle with is to what extent we should be increasing receipts for Marine Scotland. Marine Scotland carries out a lot of licensing functions, and there are receipts from that at the moment. But we should always keep these things under review, because we have to make sure that Marine Scotland are equipped to deal with the very industries they're serving, and therefore the industry should pick up part of the tab for doing that. So I don't have a clear proposal yet in that regard, but just in terms of this wider debate, I'm sure the committee wants to be aware of that we have to make sure that not only are we devoting public funds to support industries, but industries that are successful should hopefully put something back into the pot.
Can I have a brief supplementary on that, please?
Yes.
Just in terms of evidence that's come to our committee in the last few months, there have been particular concerns about the feeding grounds for seabirds, for instance. There was also an issue about, to go back to the RPP and future research, which will be important for blue carbon. And I'm wondering if we could seek any reassurance about the importance, from your perspective, of the issues that will help to accommodate our future conservation of the marine areas and the environment with the development of the whole range of developers that are coming forward.
Many of the issues you raise are sort of kind of new 21st century agendas, and we have been building up a lot of expertise into looking at the future of our marine environments, as well as how we underpin marine protected areas with scientific evidence. I will make the obvious point that every single subject I deal with, often the answer is we need more research. And there's only so many people in the world that can be top researchers in their chosen field, and we always want to carry out more research into a whole range of activities, and I can never meet the expectations of NGOs or others who are always calling for more research. Clearly, I very much sympathise and agree with many of the calls we receive for more research, because we want as much information at our fingertips as possible. But it's simply not possible to meet people's expectations for more and more research in every single subject. So we have to prioritise. We have a programme for research that Marine Scotland are following. And also, of course, it's not just about Marine Scotland, it's about Scottish Natural Heritage and the GNCC, which is a UK-wide body. And often some of the issues you're speaking about, such as research into bird populations in the marine environment, are carried out jointly with, SNH, GNCC, and in some cases a role for Marine Scotland as well. So it's not just about this budget in terms of some of the issues you're speaking about.
Damien McGregor.
Thanks. What additional responsibilities will Marine Scotland have at ports due to the Common Fishery Policy reforms, especially in relation to extra landings or unwanted species? And have these been accounted for in the budget?
There's a lot of discussion going on just now about that, because quite clearly we have a lot of the detail to work out how to implement the new Common Fisheries Policy. And the landing obligation for fish caught out with quota, which is part of the discard bans, is clearly going to be something that's going to be quite challenging to police, to monitor. And, you know, there's a lot of, as I said, thinking about how to actually do that on the ground. Now, clearly, our Marine Scotland compliance officers are there already, doing their existing jobs, and they'll have to build that into their responsibilities. They're based at the ports. I'll ask Linda to come in here, because Linda Rossborough actually heads up Marine Scotland and is wrestling with all these new issues that are coming onto the agenda, if that's okay, Convener, and maybe Linda can give you a bit of insight.
Yes, I mean, certainly it is going to be challenging to deliver a land all obligation, and we would need to be working on that on a regional basis with our partners, and that work has started, setting up the structures for that to happen. We've also started the pilots, which are actually going on at the moment, which are looking at the sorts of technologies and the sorts of behaviours and management regime that might work. And we will be studying very carefully the implications of that, and that will have to be worked through in terms of these European structures. In terms of the particular question that you're asking about the money and the resources to do it, a key element of that is the new European Maritime and Fisheries Fund that is coming along, and that is still under negotiation in Europe. It's been delayed a bit from what might have been thought to have been the start date of January next year. The original ambition was that the Common Fishery Policy reforms and this new grant scheme would come in at the same time. Now, the earliest that we might expect that to be agreed would be April of next year, and that's quite a challenging timetable. But there is an increase in the budget line in relation to European fisheries grants, specifically to allow for the new programme coming in, which will be a key part of funding the new requirement under the Common Fisheries Policy, at the same time as finishing off the European Fisheries Fund with its existing responsibilities. And that's why we have the uplift in the programme in the line.
There appears to be an inconsistency in the draft budget for 2014-15, as that states that there is a 1.8 million reduction rather than an actual 3.3 million reduction. And the reason given for the reduction is that, and I quote, realistic levels of spending at the beginning of the next programme, which has been delayed until later in 2014. And I'm just wondering what the reason is for this and what the subsequent effect on the fishing sector might be.
Okay. Well, if I may, in terms of your first question, that was the difference between the net and the gross figures. So the 1.8 figure was the Scottish Government contribution, and the 3 figure is the total allowing for the European contribution. So that was the reason for the two different figures there. And in relation to your second point, when you asked about the reason for the delay, that's exactly the issue that I was mentioning already, that the agreement at European level on this measure was decoupled from the Common Fisheries Policy negotiations and is taking place on a slightly slower timescale. And therefore, the programme will not start on the 1st of January, but will start later in the year at a date that we don't yet know.
Okay.
Thank you. Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. Sticking with marine issues, Linda Rossborough just mentioned the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. Now, I'd be keen to hear your views, Cabinet Secretary, on the EMFF and the impact on this budget. I believe in July you stated that Scotland's fishing and aquaculture sectors deserve a fair share of the EMFF. Particularly given that Scotland has 61% of the UK fishing zone and 17% of the EU total employment in aquaculture. So I'd like to ask if that fairer share of the EMFF has been forthcoming and what impact that has had on the budget.
Well, thank you for raising that issue, which clearly just follows on from the previous exchange. I'm very disappointed that once again we have put the case for a fairer share of an existing European budget, just in the way that our farmers and rural communities have lost out due to the UK government's unwillingness to stand up for us in Europe to secure a fairer share of the agriculture and rural development budgets, despite the fact that other countries received uplifts. They were already starting from a better place than where Scotland were in any case, but they get further uplifts. The same situation appears to apply to the fishing funds as well. Currently, we get 40% of the UK's allocation under fisheries funds. In our estimation, we are entitled to 60% of the UK funds, and we will make that case and continue to make that case. And also within Europe, in terms of the wider European negotiation, we had a UK government again that didn't want to argue for a greater share of the fisheries funds to come to Scotland. And yet, if you just look at some of the examples that other countries have received, you will see in very stark terms just how much Scotland is losing out on. Our share, for instance, under the current arrangements is a third of what Denmark receives and less than half of the allocation to Latvia. So Scotland, a coastal nation, a fishing nation, a marine nation, gets a poorer share by far of the marine and fisheries funds than these other small countries, which are the same size or indeed smaller than Scotland. And in terms of the importance of their coastal communities and fishing industries, you know, we are in a much better place to argue for a greater share of the funds. So unfortunately, this is what happens when you have a UK government who don't share your priorities, and we're unsuccessful in persuading the UK government to argue for a greater share of the fisheries budget for Scotland. Now the debate's turned to, just like the agricultural funds, to how we split the UK budget in fisheries funds. And I can assure you that I'll continue to make a case that we deserve a greater share of these funds. These funds are used for instance, adapting to discard-free fisheries, for helping fish processing and onshore sectors expand and build new units or better units or more efficient units, to help fishing vessels become more energy efficient. There's a whole array of projects that are funded through this fund. And again, we will face a situation, because we're getting less than a fair share, that not as many of those projects will proceed to the benefit of the Scottish economy than would have otherwise been the case.
Yes.
Thank you. Presumably you'll be pushing the case with the new Fisheries Minister, but up to date, has the new Fisheries Minister in the UK government, up to date, has the UK's justification been explained for their stance?
Well, firstly, you mentioned the fact there's a new Fisheries Minister. Perhaps I should just allude to that. I very much look forward to meeting the new Fisheries Minister, and I want to wish Richard Bennion, who I worked well with, the outgoing Fisheries Minister, all the best for the future. And he was genuinely a good man to work with, and I hope he has a good future ahead of him. And I want to thank him for working with me over the past 3 years or so. I am, of course, disappointed that we now face the prospect of having to familiarise and educate the next fishing minister that's just been appointed, who I think is my number 5 in terms of who I've had to deal with over the last few years. And I will have to now ensure that he is brought up to date as soon as possible with Scotland's priorities, with the nature of Scotland's fishing communities, with some of the big challenges we face, as well as some of the asks we have, especially given we're on the eve of the next round of talks to resolve the mackerel dispute. We're also on the eve of implementing the new Common Fisheries Policy, and we're on the eve of the end-of-year fishing negotiations. So I'll have to spend a great deal of time and effort, once again, for the 5th time, or maybe even my 6th time, I'll have to calculate that, I've lost count now, to bring the UK Fisheries Minister up to speed on what really matters to Scotland. And I think the fact there's been such a high turnover of fishing ministers in the UK government perhaps does illustrate a lack of commitment, and the lack of continuity, of course, causes significant problems for other administrations, and first and foremost for our fishing industries and fishing communities, who have to get used to the new face. And, you know, I've lost the person they were dealing with closely in recent times. So I've got that off my chest, but I very much look forward to working with the new Minister, and I, of course, am very keen to meet him as soon as possible, given the number of pressing agendas on our agenda I could, of course, virtually say the same thing for agricultural ministers, because my agricultural counterpart from Whitehall has also been moved on, and I've got a new face to get to know there as well. So I've got a lot of introductions to do over the next few days. In terms of the case being made by the UK Government for the fisheries funds, clearly this will be one issue I'll ask the new Fishing Minister to take a refreshing approach to, and perhaps show more sympathy to Scotland's case for a better share of the fisheries funds. And as I said, we are in the middle of the debate over the UK allocation of the UK's fishing funds. So I will wait to hear with interest how they defend the status quo.
I have a couple of supplementaries in this, but I'll be recommending to our colleagues in this committee that we invite Dan Rogerson, the Agriculture, and George Eustace, the Fisheries Minister, to come and speak to this committee, as their predecessors did before, and at an early stage, so that we too can get a handle on their approach to these urgent matters. Turning to fishing again, it was interesting to pick up concerns at the Scottish Fishermen's Federation dinner about whether the views of fishermen, which are now sought in terms of the actual levels of stocks and so on, is being taken seriously in the process, whilst they're collaborating with the science. How well are the fishermen's views being taken into account when these debates about quotas are being agreed or debated?
Well, I think firstly we should highlight the good news, which Scotland's fish stocks are recovering, and that has largely been down to a huge amount of effort from our fishing fleets, who have made significant sacrifices, who have gone through constant change and adaptation and had to adopt new technical gears, selective gears, and deal with a myriad of complex European regulations, and yes, sometimes Scottish regulations as well. So I want to pay tribute to the fishing industry for how far we've come. But clearly there are so many diverse issues across Scotland's fisheries. The issues facing Western Isles prawn fishermen are different to the Clyde fishermen, are different to the North East of Scotland fishermen. And then we have the large vessels in the mackerel sector down to the small inshore vessels of Pitt and Weem or South West Scotland. So we have a diverse sector there, and as you can imagine, I have many robust debates over the future of fishing policy with many different sectors and many different subjects, as we do face up to the ongoing significant challenges we do face in many localised areas in Scotland and with certain fish stocks. But the general picture is more positive than it's been for a long, long time in terms of the recovery of fish stocks, and we should recognise that. But also, moving forward, addressing some of those challenges, I'm always wanting to explore new ways of how we can involve the fishing industry at the heart of decision making, and to help us collect the data that we require in the first place, to work with our scientists to make sure we've got the best possible information. And I was very pleased recently at the University of Aberdeen to visit a training session for skippers who'd been invited to come along and work with the scientists, and then in turn, once they have done that training, can then participate in some trials for us, for the government, for Marine Scotland, with their vessels. And I want to really closely engage with our skippers and fishermen with the science and help them, when they're at sea, help with the science, collect information, feed it back into the process. And indeed, the committee will be aware that we launched a £6 million package out of this year's budget. So it's not really part of the discussion, perhaps, for next year's budget we're discussing today, but this year's budget. And you know, half of that funding is towards working with the fleet on scientific trials and employing the fleet to undertake some of the scientific work for us. That's part of the reason why that training course took place. So I think we are moving forward. You know, it's a very difficult area of policy, many different views, and a very diverse sector. So I'm not saying that regulators and fishing ministers are always the most popular people with our fishing communities or our fishing industry. But you know, I think we're working well together in a number of really key areas.
I just wanted to highlight the citizen science involved, which is an important concept, and hope that the fisheries labs will take on board the fishermen's views increasingly as they're being involved in the process of working with the science. I'd like to ask another point just before we go on regarding a technical matter, and we talked about how fish is handled, how we're dealing with the stocks at sea. I just wonder in general if we're looking for stocks to be handled by seeing that they are weighed at sea, so that if there's going to be issues related to what were called discards or unwanted species, that it's possible that all the amounts are actually in future weighed at sea, rather than having to be weighed or sampled on shore.
Well, clearly we've got the new weighing regulation from Europe, which I know had some teething issues and was causing some concern amongst our fishermen how to implement that in Scotland, and we did of course seek some flexibility to help us do that. In terms of weighing at sea, yes, it's something which I think should be considered, and I'm happy to write back to you on where that's got to in terms of where we think it might go in the future. I think Linda wants to come in here and raise that briefly.
We're just looking very quickly at some interesting trials of how the landing ban would be implemented, and looking at how you can make sure everything that comes onto the ship is a key part of that. So we're actually actively working on that with skippers.
It would be useful to hear some more information about that, because I think there are ports around and fishermen around who would like to be up to speed on that. We've got a couple more questions now on other related matters. I think we come on shore. Jim Hume.
Yes, it's just regarding a contingency fund. Unfortunately, back in 2001, I was presiding over the Lothian Borders NFU, so I remember well everything regarding the foot and mouth outbreak, and God forbid we ever have to see that again. Part of the issues at that stage was that animal health was a devolved matter, but the budget was reserved, if I recall correctly. That, in the last parliamentary session, I believe, was changed. So I'm just wondering, within your own budget, have you got funds identified as a contingency fund for, as I said, God forbid, if we see any outbreaks such as foot and mouth disease?
Well, I'm very pleased that Scotland's animal health record is getting better all the time, and very grateful we don't have some of the animal health issues to deal with that other countries do. And I feel for them having to go through what they're going through just now, particularly south of the border with the TB eradication plan that they have in place, which is clearly very painful for all parts of that debate down south. In terms of whether there's a foot and mouth outbreak in Scotland, what would happen? Well, clearly my priority is to make sure that doesn't happen in the first place, but there is no contingency plan for that, or contingency, sorry, apologies, there is definitely a contingency plan, but there's no contingency fund for that. That is not practice within government. The debate before, of course, before we had the animal health budget devolved from Westminster, was to persuade the UK government during previous outbreaks to access the UK Treasury contingency, which of course the UK ministers refused to do, and as a result we did not get UK funds to help us cope with the additional costs with dealing with the outbreak in Scotland for the most recent outbreaks. However, since then the animal health budget has been devolved, as you quite rightly highlight, and the situation is that we do not keep a contingency fund. Should there be a requirement for such a fund, that is a cross-government issue, and we would expect the Scottish Government to step in, and I would be knocking on John Swinney's door if that were the case.
And you're saying that's, sorry, through the convener, of course, you're saying that's common practice for all governments not to actually keep a fund?
Well, I'm just saying it's not recommended as good practice in terms of how you steward your finances across my portfolios. And, I think you'll find, as exemplified by the UK government's recent refusal to access even their treasury funds to help Scotland, that DEFRA, I doubt, would have any contingency fund for a foot-and-mouth outbreak at the moment either. So all I'm saying is, should that occasion arise, we would have the policy of wider Scottish Government step in to help, if that were going to be the case.
Thank you.
Graham Day.
Thank you. Briefly, mine is more an issue of process. Could you outline the process, Cabinet Secretary, for identifying and then allocating carry forward from previous year's budgets? And can you advise us whether you have any carry forward to play with at the moment from last year?
I'll ask Jonathan Price to come in here, who deals with our finances and who deals with our financial colleagues elsewhere in Scottish Government. But essentially the answer to that is no. Clearly there's flexibility working with across governments, taking into account the circumstance of each portfolio, and we've had a hardship fund for weather payments for agriculture, and we've also had a £6 million package we've delivered recently for the fishing industry, which I just referred to. And clearly in some of those circumstances we've had to ask for help from out with our portfolios, and Scottish Government has worked collectively on those issues. Jonathan may wish to add just something there.
Really just to reinforce that point, that we manage the Scottish Government finances across the whole of the Scottish Government portfolios. So if there were a question of a carry forward, it doesn't sit with the individual portfolio. And as the Cabinet Secretary has been explaining, we take advantage of that as well, in terms of as the year goes forward, emerging underspends in some part of the Scottish Government are offset against overspends in other parts. And as I say, we within the rural and environment portfolio have also made use of that. There is a treasury mechanism called the budget exchange mechanism that enables resources to be carried forward in the overall Scottish Government budget from one year to the next, but that's managed centrally again by John Swinney and his finance team.
Right, move on to equalities issues, I think, next, if we can, to Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, as you'll know, all the committees have been asked by the Equal Opportunities Committee to look at the mainstreaming of equalities issues within the range of portfolios. And there is, of course, the Equality Statement, which is issued with the budget, as we all know. This year, in perhaps in synergy, I would say, with the Equal Opportunities Committee, our committee agreed that we would focus our inquiries in this respect on disability issues, not exclusively, but in the main, in rural areas. And obviously some of these disability issues will come within your own portfolios, such as the assessment of disability in relation perhaps to rural broadband and the possibilities there. But could I ask you, as well as within your own portfolio, what discussions you've been able to have, or how you're working with colleagues in Cabinet to ensure that issues in remote and rural areas, which are equality issues, are reflected in the development and delivery of policies such as health and transport and also education? So broad-ranging, really, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a very broad question, but clearly the reason why the government publishes an equality statement alongside the budget is because it's a very important issue, and we're very conscious that we have to be mindful to put all our policies to test to ensure that people who are disadvantaged or who face difficult circumstances are not precluded from benefiting from our policies. So, for instance, the National Parks Authority and the Forestry Commission, for instance, have this very high up their agenda to ensure that people with disabilities are able, for instance, to access forestry estates and for leisure and health reasons. Likewise, the National Parks Authority ensures that that's factored into their work. In terms of transport, rural broadband, clearly my colleagues have primary responsibility and we coordinate with them from the rural dimensions. But in terms of equalities issues, they'd largely be driven by the relevant ministers. So transport equalities issues would be driven by the Transport Minister, and rural broadband would be Nicola Sturgeon as the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure. Where I interject there, of course, is in terms of rural proofing and making sure there's a rural dimension to right across all government policy, but for equalities they would be also taken forward by the relevant ministers. But it's something we are very conscious of in our own portfolios, and as I said, it largely relates to the outdoors in these sort of areas in terms of access.
And are you able to reassure me about the possibility of discussions with Cabinet colleagues, if I may ask, about the other portfolio areas where, for instance, in rural transport, accessibility to the actual mode of transport or whatever, that those discussions would be ongoing within the budget discussions?
Yes, I'll certainly make a point of giving that attention, just to ensure that we can give you comfort on that point.
We have a number of questions around the equalities issue. We're trying to see how they fit in. But first of all, supplementary from Jamie McGregor.
Just in relation to to increasing the number of people who can use the outdoors, is the Minister aware of the Highland Disabled Ramblers Association, of which I have to admit I'm honorary president, which sets an example in using scooters to get people out on outdoor rambles, and is based in the Black Isle, and a very good model which could be followed in other parts of Scotland.
Well, no, thank you for that information. I can't profess to be familiar with it, so it's interesting to hear what you're saying. Clearly, we have other initiatives that are funded, for instance, through the Climate Challenge Fund, where electric bikes have been introduced to some areas around Aviemore and other areas of Scotland, which enables people who perhaps could not otherwise cycle long distances to use those bikes. So we, as I said before, we're very keen to help in any way we can, and we do build into our support for the National Parks Authority, for the Forestry Commission, to ensure there's access for people of all abilities.
Right, well, see if we can get into the the policy area here. The EU programmes are in a 7-year cycle, as we know, and the opportunity to design these programmes and impact positively on equality groups in the future is an ongoing task. It's been stated on page 58 of our budget document. Can you tell me how we find out what steps are being taken to design these programmes to impact positively on equalities groups in the future in relation to the rural portfolio?
Well, I'm happy to write back to you about current work
Yes.
underway with the Rural Development Programme, because clearly we are in the middle of a consultation, and we are going to have a further consultation on the SRDP. I think in November is the expected date for that. So clearly, as part of the consultation process, and as we rebuild these 7-year programmes moving forward, we will be taking it into account, and I'm happy to write back about how that will be done.
Helpful, thank you. Have you another point, Jean Baxter?
I think it's possible
Good
to
answer.
an answer convening.
Okay,
Yes.
if there's nothing more there, then fair enough. You're happy
I
enough?
think it's okay, yeah, thanks.
Right. Well, I think we've reached a point where we've covered most of the houses. I'd like to thank you and your officials for these answers. Gives us a chance to try and make as constructive contributions as possible to the budget debate. So thank you, Cabinet Minister, Secretary, and we will suspend for a short while before we bring in the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right, we'll make a start to agenda item 3. Scottish Government's draft Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. And we move to this final agenda today with a panel of witnesses which include Kay Jenkinson, Communication Specialist in the UK Climate Impact Programme, Professor John Rowan, Professor of Physical Geography at the University of Dundee, and David Thompson, Senior Analyst in the Committee on Climate Change. Welcome to you all. We've got a number of themes we'd like to look at, and we may be able to be broad-ranging so that the questions flow from the initial points in each theme. On the impacts on Scotland, can you summarise what you think the scale of the challenge for Scotland is facing adapting to the climate change which we're expecting at the moment? And if you just indicate, I'll bring you in first of all. So who wants to start?
Yep.
Thank you, David.
The committee did a report, I don't know if you're aware of it, a couple of years ago now, how well is Scotland preparing for climate change, November 2011. And within that we summarised at quite a high level some of the key threats and indeed opportunities that face Scotland with a changing climate. And without going into a lot of detail, we did highlight that there are opportunities potentially with high average temperatures. This isn't just for Scotland, it's UK-wide, but there could be fewer winter deaths and indeed lower demand for heating, so with potential positive implications there for energy and energy bills. There's also, of course, the potential for new crops or new types of crops and expansion of the area currently suitable for agriculture. Although we need to be careful there because there may be some negative implications if that resulted in soil carbon being lost from the cultivation of peat soils, but still a potential opportunity. And of course the melting of the Arctic ice sheet, which again will have negative consequences in many other ways, but could result in new or enhanced trade opportunities. Again, though, there may be also risks there of expanded shipping. But there are, we shouldn't be blind to the fact that there may well be some opportunities with a changing climate. But there will be a number of threats. And one thing that the committee highlighted in its report in 2011, and it's really the approach that the committee tends to take when assessing risk, is really understanding what the current scale of vulnerability is to current climate and current weather conditions. And we did note that there are a number of social, economic and indeed environmental characteristics that are likely to increase the vulnerability of Scotland to climate hazards. So some of those, again, at a high level include quite an uneven spread of population, so pockets of densely built-up areas which are at risk from flooding, particularly surface water flooding, but also very remote communities who are vulnerable to disruption of transport links and critical services from any increase in the frequency and magnitude of storms. There's an ageing population, again that's not unique to Scotland, but is particularly an issue, and there are health challenges, particularly among deprived or communities with deprivation. And again, that means that the vulnerability is generally higher to climate hazards, again particularly flooding. A number of the economic sectors are sensitive to climate, so food and drink, for example, tourism and energy. And indeed, the sort of global nature of Scotland's economy, very large export businesses. I think we found that in 2011, anyway, there was the value of exports to the Scottish economy is in the region of £21 billion a year. But that does mean that there's the potential for exposure to international impacts of climate change, which need to be considered. Some of the infrastructure, the critical national infrastructure, both transport, energy, information and communication technology, a number of those networks are concentrated in quite strategic corridors, so again exposed to severe weather events like landslips. And there's a number of ports which are also potentially at risk. And of course Scotland has a wealth of natural resources in terms of forest area, moorland, peatlands. I think Scotland contains more than half of the UK's deep peat soil resource, which are important culturally and economically, but also very sensitive to any changes in climatic conditions. So there's a whole range of vulnerabilities which potentially could make Scotland, or could be of increasing significance with a changing climate that need to be considered in any response to climate change.
Some more, yes. Kay Jenkinson.
I just endorse everything that David said, and I certainly that gives the sort of physical framework. But I think there's also, alongside the physical impacts of a changing climate, there's also the demands it put on our society to accommodate the change, attitudes and behaviours, and we really need to take citizens with us on the journey to adaptation. And I think there's also we found in the work, the research that we've been involved in is about those impacts maybe on infrastructure, for example. There's quite a lot of interdependencies there, and it's trying to unpick those interdependencies is very challenging, but is also very necessary to make sure that a failure in one particular sector doesn't cascade and create failures in other areas.
Expand on that a little.
It's kind of, for instance, I'm trying to think of an example of one example that we've been quoted was something like when you get a lot of, say, school closures because of heavy snow, the NHS suffers because so many of its staff have to stay at home to look after their kids. So it's trying to unpick some of those things that are not very obvious, and there are other ones that are kind of maybe a bit clearer. So if you're a water pumping station, you're dependent on energy supply. If that energy supply is under threat, then clearly then your water pumping station may have problems if it doesn't have sufficient backup power. So there are those sorts of things, but there are also those ones like the NHS and the school closures that's kind of quite important to think about too.
I mean, the only thing I would add is I thought that was a very clear summary by both my colleagues. Is the other classic example of cascade is, for example, where you've got a power station or emergency services facilities within a floodplain zone, and so a flood hits a police station or a fire service, and consequently thereafter the emergency response is compromised.
A number of people want to come in on this to expand on it, so Jamie McGregor first.
Oh, thank you, Convener. Regarding the most significant threats and opportunities for Scotland, we've already seen examples of it in the marine fisheries, which is obviously a very important issue for Scotland particularly, of the mackerel and herring stocks moving further north. And this is considered that they're following the food, and this has caused problems with Iceland and the Faroes overfishing in certain areas. How will, do you think, in the future, if the rising seawater temperatures are going to go on, further impact on fish stocks, which are important to Scotland now, and will there be any movement of fish stocks from southern seas into the Scottish areas?
Well, I mean, I must confess I'm not an expert on marine matters, but I think one of the obvious consequences of climate change is this migration of species into new climate spaces. So as maybe the cold water species move north and move into that territorial domain around Iceland, of course, then there are supposed to be other hitherto warmer dwelling species moving north. So, for example, we see movement of bass further up the coast than hitherto has been the case. So I think that is an inevitable consequence of what's going to go on.
Could these, though, the introduction of these species, could that be commercially viable for the Scottish fleet?
Actually, I just think it raises issues around whether the current regulatory framework or current trade agreements are flexible enough to cope with what could be changes that could be driven in part by climate. And we don't know necessarily that changing fish distributions are all solely down to climatic changes. It could be down to fishing practices as well, of course. Again, I'm not an expert in fisheries or marine, but just to highlight that it does in itself, any changing in fish stock, whatever the cause, does mean that there needs to be a more flexible approach to how you to manage to the regulatory framework that manages fish stocks.
Graham Day and then Jim Hume.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I just wanted to be clear on something. Taking account of the impact of climate change, not just domestically, but beyond these islands as it would impact upon Scotland, is it fair to say that the negative aspects of climate change greatly outweigh the positive opportunities that you've touched upon?
I think the reported, I'm just kind of thinking on the kind of the stuff I've seen in academic literature and other grey literature in the media, and for many communities, wherever you are, the negative consequences are the ones that we've seen most widely reported. There clearly will be some opportunities, but I think from where we are now, it all looks pretty negative. It mostly looks negative.
I think at the global scale, overall, the picture is more negative. If you take agriculture, for example, certainly there will be some parts of the world, including perhaps Northwest Europe, which in the shortish term, as in over the next 20 or 30 years, may benefit from an increase in temperatures of, say, 1 or 2 degrees, and increased CO2 concentration in the atmosphere may also potentially increase yields. That's possible. Other parts of the world which are very heavily reliant on rainwater for irrigation clearly won't benefit, and so there could be, again, shifts in global food production as a result of that. But even in areas which may potentially benefit from increased temperature and CO2 concentration, there will be other issues which maybe would make it harder to exploit those opportunities, like water availability, for example. So I'm afraid it's never a straightforward picture, but I think most experts, academics, as it were, would suggest that on balance the risks out and the threats outweigh the opportunities.
And I think a lot of this also depends on our response to the change that creates. So if we are able to, first of all, clearly minimise the change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and secondly, adapting to accommodate the changes, then the negative impacts may be minimised. If we're not good at doing those, either or both of those things, clearly the consequences will be more severe.
So, in reality, if we adopt a let's just wait and see what happens approach, as opposed to being extremely proactive now, we're storing up considerable problems for ourselves.
I think that's unquestionable. I think the arguments that the opportunities, and there clearly are opportunities around increases in production in agriculture and forestry, and it's often spoken about there could be positive benefits with respect to tourism, are clear and they're to be grasped. And similarly, there's major opportunities, I think, in terms of embracing the low-carbon economy and providing business and enterprise around enabling technologies and cultural practices to make that happen. But the risks of inaction or delayed action, I think, universally are agreed to far outweigh the do-nothing situation.
Just quickly add to that. It doesn't mean that do nothing or wait and see is not necessarily always the right approach. Sometimes it is acceptable to actually, as long as you're continually thinking about it and monitoring impacts over the long term, it may be that it's more appropriate, more proportional to not take a lot of action now. But again, it's as long as you are, as a decision maker, explicitly considering the risks and not just being blind to them, then wait and see could be an option. So I wouldn't discount it completely, but there are, across almost all sectors that are vulnerable to climate change, climate impacts, there are measures that can be taken now to build resilience. And I think a key issue that particularly the committee is always wanting to try and understand when it's assessing progress in adaptation is, are we seeing, is the uptake of those measures at a level that we'd expect to see given the risks from climate change? And as we found, particularly in our analysis in England, there are some measures where we haven't seen the sort of uptake that really we would expect to see. I'll give you an example. Property level flood protection measures. Very low uptake in England, despite the risk to over 1 million houses from flood risk. And that's the sort of examples of the sort of measures which, in a well-adapting society, you maybe would see more uptake now, as well as in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Jim Hume. Thanks, Convener. The panel's already mentioned that places like ports are at risk, which is no surprise, and floodplains, anything that's been built on a floodplain, of course. But in Scotland, has there been any geographical areas that have been identified as perhaps being more vulnerable than others?
If I can just answer that first. When we did our report in 2011, one thing we tried to do was try and actually answer that question as much as possible. Understand spatially where is the highest level of vulnerability, the highest level of risk. And we actually struggled, I would say, to find a lot of the data. This was 2 years ago, so maybe things have improved. I know that SEPA have done more work on flood risk mapping since the publication of this report. But generally, we did find it quite difficult to quantify risk in specific locations. And I think that is something which we said in our, report, that there could be improvements made to better understand and quantify risk.
And I would add to that. I mean, I think there are particularities of the Scottish geography with its, significant upland ranges and its coastal and island maritime, particularly in the west and in the Northern Isles, which increase susceptibility to these sorts of issues. So, for example, a major concern may be the ferry communications with the Western Isles or the Northern Isles. There's major issues in relation to the stability of the deep peat in the Highlands, in the Cairngorm. And then, I think, as David mentioned earlier, with respect to infrastructure and communications, because we have such a dense population concentrated in the central belt, and then these major kind of arterial connections between centres of population, it's those which are particularly susceptible to issues such as landsliding, blocking power lines or damaging roads and so on, railway communications.
I think I'd just also add to that, and also in terms, and I don't know if this is quite the question you're asking, but the sort of the groups that you would identify in a community as vulnerable, so maybe the elderly or the very young or the sick, they're going to be, climate change kind of adds to their vulnerabilities, so they would tend to be quite severely affected. And Joseph Rentry Foundation are doing quite a lot of work looking at climate justice, which is this idea that the impacts of climate change are not felt uniformly throughout society, but they're felt disproportionately by the most vulnerable. So there is some work already underway looking at that sort of area and that territory. So it's about characteristics of communities and groups in society, not just the physical landscape.
It would be quite interesting for the committee to see the Rowntree Foundation's work on that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, indeed. I'm thinking about the IPCC report and its approach, but just to take a scenario which has been discussed, the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Drift weakening, Scotland getting colder, potentially fish that have gone north coming back south, pelagic fish, entirely possible. Also the need, because it's colder, to produce more electricity if we don't insulate our houses, or the various aspects of that we need to adapt to. Do you think that the IPCC estimations and calculations allow us to plan for particular policies that can cope with these potentials between now and the end of the century?
I mean, I think that what we've always seen with all the climate projections, and I'm sure my colleagues here are probably better qualified than me to say, is that we see this scale of kind of this envelope of risk and probability. And I think, and then we've got this background of natural variability, which always happens, which always throws in an unusually warm winter or a very cool summer or whatever. And I think what we're just seeing is that envelope, our kind of personal envelope of risk that we're looking at. It's not that we're moving up and getting warmer, it's just that the envelope, that risk is getting broader almost. So we will still have the cold winters because that's natural variability. We've seen that recently. So I think in terms of our risk, we have to just be better prepared. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, I would agree with that. Decision making, particularly in the long term, in the face of there's a huge amount of uncertainty about the precise projections and the way of future climate. Even if we didn't see the effect you referred to about the weakening of the North Atlantic Drift, even if that didn't happen, there's still uncertainty about the range of temperature rise, and a lot more uncertainty, in fact, about what that would mean for rainfall. And it really is important then to, as a principle, I suppose, when making decisions in the face of this uncertainty, particularly decisions that are being made today which have long-lasting consequences, so the provision of infrastructure which is going to last for 100 years, for example, that decision makers try and, as much as possible, and consider the different range of climate futures in the decisions that they make today, which sounds a straightforward thing to say, but actually in practice often isn't that easy to do. Just one thing I'd also add, though, is with the IPCC report, is that we've only had, of course, one of the three reports published so far, the science report. The next report, which I think is due at the end of March next year, will be looking more at the impacts and vulnerabilities, and it won't be at a nation scale, but it will give a better idea of what the update of the science from the report earlier this month, last month, what that means for, according to scientists and their modelling, what that means for actual impacts. And that's where I think there'll be perhaps more information around potential weakening of not just the North Atlantic drift, but other ocean currents globally as well, and what that may mean. But it's a good example of needing to plan for a range of futures as much as that's possible to do.
I think, may I just also add to that, though? I think there are also accepted ways in which organisations can look forward and have foresight to those sorts of issues. And, for example, within the Climate Exchange, which is this centre of expertise on climate change set up by Scottish Government, within the adaptation work stream, there are specifically research underway looking at scenarios in future so that we can look at possible climate projections from the work of UKSIP and others and the IPCC and get this envelope of climatic futures. But we can also superimpose upon that an understanding of socioeconomic futures through scenario analysis. And then it's the bringing together of those two different domains. What would a particular nature at work or a command and control or a business as usual type of socioeconomic environment, how would that play against these climate futures? And it's through the kind of interplay of both that I think you can look at the range of possibilities and try and take on board this kind of flexible adaptation pathway principle that allows us to respond. As long as we're monitoring and keeping an eye on what's going on, then hopefully we can anticipate maybe either short-term shocks or longer-term chronic changes. And the kind of flip-flop associated with the relocation of the North Atlantic drift is like a kind of classic example. That may happen. And if it happens, then we need to ensure we've got a level of preparedness and we've thought that through in terms of some response options.
Thank you. Graham Day wants to ask a bit more about this.
Yeah, if I may, just to develop this a little bit. We seem to have moved away in recent years from stating that things will happen with absolute certainty to talking about highly likely to occur, likely to occur. We've even in some cases got to percentage of probability. I just wonder if you look at the UK climate projection figures for Scotland, which are broken down into 3 geographical areas, which, for example, predict annual temperature increase by 2050 of between 1.9 and 2.2%. We even have figures that talk about sea level rises at locations around the coast of up to 24 centimetres at Lerwick, which is pretty specific. I wonder, when we look at figures like these, what is the percentage of likelihood that they are accurate in real terms?
I can't give you a percentage figure in that respect, but I do know that the idea of the UK CP09 projections was to give a range, which it does. It's modelling, so it will come up with quite a precise number because it is going through the modelling process. I think sea level rise, actually, the modelling is generally more certain than for temperature and particularly for rainfall, precipitation. So it can be quite precise in its projections, but they are projections for sea level rise. I do know that the Met Office are currently re-examining the most up-to-date climate models that have been used in the most recent IPCC report, or referenced in the most recent IPCC report. And they're doing a project for DEFRA at the moment to look at if there is a need to update the 09 projections. And I don't know the details of that or even the timescale, but if there is a need to do that, then the idea is that it will feed into the next climate change risk assessment due in 2017. So there is an ongoing process of improving the modelling, but I think, to be fair, there's always been, particularly over the last, more recently, there's always been the language of uncertainty, as it were, by not trying to be too precise in the language and to ensure that people are aware that there's a range of possibilities. But as it's models, it does come up with some quite precise numbers, so I can understand how that sometimes can be a bit counterintuitive.
I ask more from the point of view that there are still a smaller number, but still a number of people out there who deny that there is a climate change issue. there are some pretty scary figures there. I think most of us understand that there is a big problem at play. I just wonder, in terms of, even if we're talking about, is it highly likely these are accurate, is it likely they're accurate? I'm just trying to get a handle on that for the benefit of these type of people.
I think the consensus would be that the evidence is pretty unequivocal. The other issue about models is that that is a whole culture, and it's a whole group of people with particular skill sets and applications. One of the characteristics of the modern modelling approach is not to rely on a single model, which has its own data assumptions, its own data inputs, its own boundary conditions that set the model up. So increasingly, in terms of these big international collaborations, we see this thing called an ensembles approach, where you run multiple models, often which have got conflicting kind of principles built within them, and then you generate these uncertainty envelopes. So you might say, I've got 50 different models and I've run them over a range of different timescales with different inputs of data, and then this generates this cloud, this maximum and minimum response, and then we take this median line. And I think in the case of UK SIP, you get these 90% and these 10% limits, which say this is the kind of best case, this is the worst case, and this is probably what we have to plan on the basis of being the most likely. So I think that one can enter into this either as an act of scientific faith, because the people are giving it their very best ability, and it's the kind of finest minds on the planet. It is rocket science in some respects, some of this climate modelling. But then ultimately, I think the kind of policy implications are about taking the precautionary principle. We see that this is likely to happen. There's a lot of work being going on in terms of looking at sea level response in Scotland, which involves quite complicated stuff, not only about the kind of oceanic response and thermal expansion, but also the local conditions, which are because the Scottish crust, the landmass itself, is still rebounding from ice loading. So we've got this isostatic uplift. So Scottish landmass, for the most part, is rising. Oceanic sea levels are rising. We've got some sort of dynamic equilibrium in Scotland. But that's not the case necessarily in every other part of the world. So you need models which are locally calibrated, take into account the best science, and then give you this kind of framework within which you can set your policies and plans.
Also, because I was involved in UK CPO9, in the comms around UK CPO9, and I think we had many hours discussing about how we present this information to people, and I think that the idea of presenting in 09, you get these sort of range of probabilities, and it's about sort of so that you can have, as a decision maker, you can have a flexible approach, so that, for instance, if you were in a local authority and thinking about gritting roads, for instance, probably not the best example. Anyway, we'll go with this one. If we were gritting roads because it was icy, then you would really want to make sure you protected the roads that were, say, to A&E. So that you would be the most cautious on that. So even maybe if it was saying there was a slight risk of ice, you'd still grit. So that would be like where you were thinking. So maybe you'd really be, your attitude to risk in that area is, you don't want to take very many risks. But if it's gritting the road that goes to the swimming pool, you don't really care. So you maybe won't do that. So that's why in some ways you get that range of options to try to help people make flexible decisions, and it's not a one-size-fits-all response. I don't know if that helps at all. I'm very sorry.
It does indeed. If I may, to go back to the point David Thompson made earlier about planning for the 100 years forward, what would you say to local authorities when they are issuing planning consent now to major developments and are perhaps accepting drainage standards, road drainage standards that meet current demand, when we're talking about by 2050 an increase of potentially in the east of Scotland another 10% rainfall? Is the message that they need to be thinking further ahead and what's coming down the track, as it were, not just simply catering for the now?
Certainly, yes. And we did some analysis again in England looking at local plans, local development plans, in relation to decisions around where to locate new development in areas of flood risk. And we found it was a mixed picture, to be fair, and there were some examples. We looked at about 50 plans in total. So not all local authorities across England, but a fair number, a fair sample. And we found that a number of them, around 10 or so, had very clearly and transparently looked at the long-term risks when made decisions very clearly and had decided where they were going to locate development in the high flood risk areas. It was because there were no other alternatives, which often is the case. But that where they were going to locate that development, they were going to ensure it was built to high standards of resilience and incorporate SUDs and other measures which... But I have to say we also found examples where, there were examples where we couldn't find that decision-making process or evidence of it. So that was that to us suggested that even though the policy framework is right and that it does require in England again local authorities to be thinking long-term about and the costs and the benefits of locating in areas of high flood risk and to apply climate scenarios, projections to that, the actual implementation on the ground was mixed. Now, I don't know if that's the case in Scotland, but it was an example in England.
May I add just one point to that? I think David also used an interesting word earlier, which was proportionate. So when we think about response, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that any new major infrastructure developments need to take into account what these possible climate futures are going to look like and think specifically in terms of their functionality under these anticipated changes. And obviously, the precautionary principle would say it's always better to err on the side of safety. But I think we have to add a little caveat about this kind of concept of maladaptation and make sure that the measures we put in place are cost effective. So, for example, in the kind of classic example of putting in new hard flood defences on river valleys, for example, flood embankments, you may, for example, anticipate that through climate change there's going to be more frequent high magnitude flood events, increasing the local flood risk. And consequently, you might build a flood wall that's designed to the current standard of 1 to 200. But looking forward, we could see that that's going to change. So you might, in anticipation of change and flexibility downstream, put in a bigger foundation at the beginning that would allow you to build the wall a little bit higher. But as soon as you put that in, that's more upfront capital cost and so on. So it's quite a nuanced set of thinking there, and we have to make sure that in anticipating these actions, the response is proportionate.
Jamie McGregor, supplementary.
Just you mentioned calibrating local models, which I think is very important. In the Western Isles, for example, you've got the causeways recently built, and if you get the Churchill barriers, which go between North Uist, Benbecula, and South Uist. And these are examples where only fairly recently 5 people lost their lives in a storm surge. And I believe, people are looking at making access to higher ground and that sort of thing already. But in those sort of terms, if you're looking at an increase of 18 centimetres around the Western Isles, which appears to be being said here, that is a worrying feature, surely, particularly for these causeways and barriers, which must be very vulnerable, I would have thought, to a rise in sea levels.
If I may, in fact, I've been involved with some research on that particular issue in the Western Isles, on looking at the South Ford bayment between North Uist and Benbecula, and particularly around the incident in 2005 when that family unfortunately lost their lives. So one of the big questions there was, has the imposition or the construction of the causeway led to a change in the tidal dynamics of that bay, which would mean that the wave environment changed, which means that you would get larger waves propagating onto the shore. Superimposed upon which is the issue of climate change, which means that there's more frequent extreme events, and superimposed upon that again is also this level of sea level rise. So there's kind of multiple conflicting factors at play here which might explain whether risk was going up or down in any particular location. And in that instance, the Western Isles Council have invested a significant sum of money undertaking the fundamental research that's needed to calibrate these local models and then understand the risk. But of course that is incredibly challenging to do in every location, so it's important that we try and extract the kind of general principles of that work and think it through in terms of kind of national risks that might follow. But certainly the latest IPCC report said that sea level rise was probably going to be higher than they had anticipated in the last report. The kind of eustatic or the global sea level response, I think, was now estimated towards the end of the century to be somewhere between 28 and 82 centimetres, so approaching a metre. Of course, that's a global response, and as I say, we have to put into the context of the Scottish response, which is conditioned by this. I mean, I hesitate to say it, but it's kind of dynamic land surface. It is still responding to its glacial legacy.
But a rise of that amount on flat land would be absolutely taking an enormous acreage, wouldn't it?
Well, it very much depends upon the configuration of the coastal zone, the shoreline itself, and fundamentally about the local exposure in terms of how waves are generating a coastal flooding problem.
It's a Highlands and Islands member at the time of the floods, as Jamie was. It's the bit you're talking about is between Benbecula and South Uist.
Yes.
You said North Uist.
Oh, forgive me.
No, it's all right. I'm just making sure that we're talking about the same thing.
Yes.
But they're
yes,
all
yes.
affected. The fact that there are islands there have been punched out by the ocean,
yes.
and you put causeways between them without a means for the water to get through, except one narrow outlet, is the adaptation issue.
Yes.
Par excellence in that area.
I mean, that's a classic example because I suspect when that particular causeway was put in place, we perhaps hadn't properly thought through some of those issues.
That's very interesting.
They were actually put in place during the war, weren't they? Those for defence.
The ones further south, the Churchill barriers were, yes. Well, the Churchill barriers in Orkney, yes.
Yeah, as well, yes. But it was wartime activity that led to that, so we've learned since then, to our cost. Can we move on to approaches to date, please? Dick Lyle wants to kick this section off.
Yes, Convener, can I thank you and good morning. It's still morning, panel. Can I turn to the UK CP09 summary, which actually makes quite grim reading before I ask the question. Drier summers, changes in soil conditions, changes in climate, changes in coastal evolution, changes in water temperatures. I could go on and on and on. It's quite grim. So because of this, what is your view on Scotland's approach to date in preparing for the impacts associated with climate change, and what could we do more now?
I can just answer that first because, as I say, we did look at this 2 years ago, and we did an assessment of what was then Scotland's adaptation framework, which is now evolving into its climate change programme. And we found that there was, well, we talked to a lot of key people within Scotland in terms of leads within Scottish Government, agencies like SEPA and SNH, businesses, local government, water companies, etc. And we found that there has been good progress, again, this was in 2011, that there had at that point been good progress in particularly in raising awareness of adaptation and the need to think about long-term climate futures, and building the capacity of key organisations to be thinking about this issue, because it hasn't been on people's radar until fairly recently, in the last 5-10 years or so. And that we saw evidence that, we've been talking about it earlier, about particularly when looking at long-term planning, that the sort of policy frameworks for a number of areas like land use planning, building regulations and marine planning and forestry were thinking long-term and were thinking about the uncertainties around climate change as part of their planning processes. So that was good news, and that there's, in a lot of sectors this is being thought about. But we didn't see that in all sectors, so we didn't see much evidence of thinking about the uncertainties with climate change in the provision of infrastructure, particularly actually the renewable energy programme and information and broadband rollout. And it could be argued that they were on shorter timescales, but even so, we didn't see much evidence of them even thinking about the implications of climate change for where they site new developments and new infrastructure, which we thought was concerning. We also felt that the framework at the time did not give sufficient weight to the important contribution that Scotland makes to global efforts, indeed, to safeguard peat carbon stores, and that peatlands were somewhat underrepresented. Well, the need for peatland restoration was underrepresented in the framework at the time, because that's a key issue when it comes to adaptation to climate change, because if peatlands are in poor condition, for a variety of reasons, then they're not going to be resilient to changes in climate, and they're more likely to hemorrhage carbon rather than just gradually lose it. And we saw a mixed picture on the uptake, as in England actually, a mixed picture on the uptake of sort of resilience measures. Like, for example, a low uptake of, as in England, of property level flood protection measures, but a high uptake of drainage in urban areas, which was encouraging. And I think one of the key issues also, and it never sounds that exciting, but we just didn't think there was much, it wasn't clear to us what was being put in place to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of adaptation and the adaptation framework and indeed the programme in actually helping to build a more resilient Scotland. And we do think there's more work to be done here in terms of thinking about the sorts of ways that you can monitor and evaluate whether your adaptation policies are being effective. And that could be through developing the sorts of indicators that we're working on at the committee and the Climate Exchange are working on that can really tell us what's happening with our vulnerability in key sectors. Are we seeing decisions being made today which are increasing our vulnerability to climate risks in the future? Or are we seeing, as I mentioned, the uptake of the sorts of measures that we would expect to see that would be reducing our vulnerability? And it's difficult to know because in many cases we haven't got the data and we haven't got the indicators, or we can't populate the indicators to tell us what's actually happening. And we think that's a key gap. And this isn't just for Scotland to say, it's also the case in England as well, and I'm sure it's the case. In fact, many countries across the world, Germany, Canada, the European Commission, it's not a country I know, but they're looking at ways of developing adaptation indicators. The OECD are looking at this for its member countries. So it's a hot topic in many respects at the moment, and I think it's one that any country's climate change programme needs to be thinking about at the outset. You shouldn't be adding on monitoring and evaluation once you've got your policy in place. It should be something that you're building into the programme at the outset, and I think that's really important. Sorry, I went on a bit there.
I think I'd echo what David said about the monitoring and the evaluation, is that, and I think in many respects, I mean, from UKSIP's point of view, we see a lot of good work that's going on at Climate Exchange. We see a lot of good work that's going on at Adaptation Scotland. We also see there's a very good research resource within Scotland. UKSIP is host to the Adaptation and Resilience to a Changing Climate network, which is a network of research projects funded by the research councils. And there's a lot of activity. A lot of those projects are across the UK, but a lot of them include research that's going on at Heriot Water, Edinburgh, for example, lots of other institutions. And so there's a huge resource of knowledge in Scotland on adaptation generally. But I think, yeah, this idea that we really need to embed the monitoring into the programme to identify, to have an understanding about what progress is being made, and also to learn the lessons, because that's, I think, really, really important, is that there's ongoing evaluation, so that if we're undertaking a particular activity, a particular policy, and it's going in one direction and suddenly it's not quite working, there's an opportunity to say, we change it, we start again, or we shift something, because I think it's really important to be flexible. And adaptation is, like David's indicated, globally we're all, the UK as a whole is probably maybe further ahead than other countries, but we're still finding our way, and I think we have to be kind of brave and kind of embrace that.
I think that idea of bravery is actually quite an important thing to my mind. I think politically Scotland and the UK have these very bold and ambitious targets in terms of mitigation. And so there's been, I think, a tremendous political drive around carbon reduction and this move to the low-carbon economy. And I think in some respects, adaptation has been not a Cinderella, but has been a little bit left behind because the political priorities were to around the targets set for mitigation. So adaptation is much more at the beginning of its journey, I think, in Scotland. And it's a journey that goes on indefinitely because it doesn't have an end point. It's constantly under review, reflection and evolution. So I think both colleagues have spoken about the various frameworks that have brought us to where we are at the moment, and we look at this new adaptation programme in front of us. I think it could do with being set a bit more on some firmer foundations, some firmer principles, and I think it could have a bit more ambition and vision within it.
Thank you for that. You know, the point that Graham Day made earlier on, there's a lot of sceptics out there, and, you know, what actually physically, you know, Scotland leading, UK's looking at it, you know, we're admitting it, Other countries are not, China, America. So what are the scientists doing, you know, from a humble politician's view? What are the scientists doing to convince the politicians in other parts of the world that we need to change, and we better change now, or we won't be able to change in 50 or 100 years' time?
Scientists, I guess, are trying to do it through the IPCC process and through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with mixed success. As I mentioned earlier, the IPCC report we've only seen a third of it so far. There's going to be more coming out over the next 6 months or so. And the next report, which I mentioned earlier in March, I'm sure will highlight even more than it has done so far, the risks and the impacts, as well as some of the opportunities which we talked about, but particularly the risks and the threats that the science is telling us faces the world. So, again, there's only so much that scientists can do, I suppose, in terms of putting out the information. That's what they're there to do, and I would say they're doing the best they can in many respects. But let's see what more comes out from the IPCC over the next 6 months.
Nigel Dunn, and then Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. Can I say I'm very interested by all that you've been saying. I'm just wondering if I come back to the idea of modelling, which the Professor mentioned. Can I say, it seems to me, and I'll declare a chemical engineering background, that if you want to model what happens to water in flooding, then water is something we understand pretty well. It doesn't go away. You know what its density is. You know what its viscosity is. You can do lots of things to model it pretty accurately. And there are some second-order effects, which you've already alluded to about temperature. But you can get pretty accurate numbers out of that. But you also mentioned socio-economic modelling and the responses of societies. Now, I have to say that's something that I kind of know nothing about, and it sounds very interesting, but it sounds virtually impossible to do in the same way as you can model water. And I'm just wondering if you could explain to us what the fundamental theory behind that might be, how accurate it can possibly be, what it could possibly tell us, please.
Well, I think if I start with an example, and I'll start with an example which is based on my own experience. I've been involved with something called the National Ecosystem Assessment, which is a UK-wide initiative trying to understand the value of natural capital and to say that environmental processes are the foundation of our lives, and things like water moving through a drainage basin. If you can slow down the flow, perhaps it will prevent flooding. If you can put that water through a wetland, perhaps it will detoxify any pollutants that are within it, and so on. So there's multiple benefits, including things like increased biodiversity and amenity value, that would flow from good environmental management. So the NEA was charged specifically with trying to understand the value of natural capital in the UK. And then specifically to move forward to think about how we respond to changes in the different drivers or pressures that exist upon the natural environment, and then ways in which we can mitigate them in order to allow these natural functions to thrive. And so part of that is in the whole socioeconomic realm. And now, forgive me, I'm a physical geographer, I don't have particular expertise in socioeconomic situations, but I think the thing to characterise the idea of scenarios in socioeconomic narratives is that you describe one possible future or a series of possible worlds wherein there are particular principles around banking, particular principles around the welfare state, particular principles around international trade relationships and so on. And so you can characterise societies depending upon their functions and forms. And so you can actually develop multiple societal pictures, and then you look at them in the future, maybe in 2050 or at the end of the century, and you see, well, where are we now? So you use these future scenarios of how people might live their lives in the future to see how we can make a journey from where we are now towards there. And so that's this idea of the scenario analysis. The climate projection adds complexity to how you might make that journey. So I hope I've made that. Have I made that clear?
Well, I think I can see the drift of where you're going. I guess what's intriguing me is the idea that you can say anything that anybody, sorry, not you personally, but anybody can say anything terribly precise, Because, as I say, when you compare it with water, there are lots of things we can say very precisely about water. But how societies actually behave is surely not something we've got a terribly good model for, or have we? Maybe there are people who really do know how these things work.
There are kind of, I mean, I don't know, and this is, I mean, similarly, I'm not an expert, but I just, the sort of analogies sometimes we draw is things like the Treasury uses economics models, which include a lot of, you know, what people are going to buy, and so there are lots of, you know, the socio-economic models are there to help us envision the future, and in the same way that we can't predict what the climate is going to be like, that we have lots of information to help us, you know, kind of take out some of the outriders to what the future is going to be like. Similarly with those socio-economic scenarios, you start to look at a pattern of the future, and I think, I don't know how well used they are. I don't know.
I think they are well used. So I mean, I think the level of precision and trying to put uncertainty on them is not appropriate here. I think what you're trying to do is to characterise what the world might look like. And if I think of just maybe the polar examples within the National Ecosystem Assessment, they have these particular labels. So one is called A Green and Pleasant Land, where there's an emphasis upon localism, local food production, very much in the low carbon spirit, very strong community relationships, good relationships with government, and that green and pleasant land where the environment's working for us and people are living in harmony with the environment. And then the opposite of that is this thing called world markets, where in fact you say that actually this is an entirely kind of capitalist framework, and what we simply want is everything driven by the minimum cost. And so we have a completely global and connected market. We don't necessarily care if there's consequences of us taking in goods or services or human resources from other parts of the world to fuel our local economic needs. So there's a kind of, in one respect, you might characterise that as being, you know, market-driven and very much optimised around money, and the other one is about harmony and good governance and you know, issues like fairness and equality, education, greenness. Those are the things that characterise that community. So in the sense, if we're talking about Scotland being fairer, smarter, happier, greener, and those sorts of things, we could see the way in which we want to go, where we want to go, and where the future that we want the population to have. And then it's a question about looking at that path and understanding how the different climate projections play through in terms of getting to that future. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Graham Day.
Thank you. Just a point in passing, Professor Rowan. You talked about the need for bravery and ambition on adaptation, but wouldn't that probably flow if we had the means of measuring adaptation in place, first of all? Because at the moment we measure CO2 emissions, we set ourselves targets, and we beat ourselves up if we fail to hit those targets, which is great. But in terms of adaptation, we don't have targets, we don't have measures, and therefore it's harder in some ways to show that ambition. Whereas if we were better able to say, well, we've done X, we've done Y, these are the reasons we've done it, this has been the impact, then suddenly you have that driver for the ambition. Or am I wrong there?
No, I think that's entirely. I accept entirely what you've just said there. I think one of the issues that needs to be resolved in terms of the draft programme is, I think, a much clearer understanding of the need to measure and to monitor, a much stronger focus on the importance of targets, aspirational or fixed, and then to put in place the enabling mechanisms and the resources to make sure that that happens. And I think if I would just make the kind of contrast between when you look in the mitigation side around, you know, the RPP2 and around the carbon reduction targets, you can see that in the second phase of that, you know, there's a lot of enabling structures put in place. I think with adaptation, because we're still at the beginning of that, I think the importance of targets, the monitoring, and the reporting need to be fleshed out much more fully.
I think that leads. Yes.
It's the committee's job, in England certainly, is to, in effect, monitor the National Adaptation Programme, and it's likely that we'll also be required to do that in Scotland as well. I mean, there could be, that's still potentially up for debate, but if we are requested by Scottish ministers to do that, then we still have a role to play in both countries in making that quite tricky assessment of progress and measuring progress. And the committee's view certainly is that that is doable, because the sorts of indicators that we're looking to develop will be able to tell us from those indicators the sorts of trends that we're seeing, that we can then make a judgment, but it will be a judgment on what they mean for how well we're preparing or not. But we think it would be helpful if the objectives set out in both programmes, the England and the Scotland programme, are as much as possible outcome focused. So they actually do, as much as possible, and it can be quite difficult, but as much as possible they do actually give quite a clear outcome for what they're seeking to achieve and over what sort of timescale. So, for example, at the moment, a number of the objectives in the draft programme are laudable, because they are around, they use terms like increased resilience. And again, we can potentially measure whether if resilience is being increased or not. But they could be a bit more specific in that they could actually give a specific outcome that they'd want to see. So it could be, for example, that your objective is to ensure that flood risk does not increase, even with climate change. And then we can measure whether flood risk is increasing over time with climate change, and whether the different factors that would be increasing or decreasing flood risk are being implemented. So are we seeing, as I mentioned earlier, the uptake of the sorts of flood resilience measures we'd expect to see, but also equally, are we seeing decisions being made now which are likely to be increasing flood risk, like developing in areas of high flood risk? So there could be an argument that some of the outcomes could be more measurable themselves. But either way, we will still, as a committee, feel that we can come to a view and a judgment, because effectively we will be reporting to both Westminster Parliament and to Scottish Parliament on progress that's being made. And that will be as an objective assessment as much as possible using the sorts of indicators that we're looking to develop.
Quite a number of bites already at the cherry of the draft Scottish adaptation programme, but Claudia Beamish, take it forward.
Right, thank you, Convener. I'm very interested to hear about the monitoring and then also the evaluation and looking at the possible outcomes for things such as resilience. You have covered, as our convener says, a lot of the issues in relation to the draft adaptation programme, but I wonder if any of you have any further comments on whether it reflects the impacts that Scotland faces as a result of climate change. I won't dare use the word accurately after the discussions today, but in broad terms.
Well, one of the tasks that was given to the establishment of the Climate Exchange, the Centre of Expertise on Climate, was to work on baselines and indicators. And the approach that's been taken in the work that's been done thus far has been specifically to try and look at the major risks as identified by the CCRA and as it pertains to Scotland, and then to try and develop a set of indicators that specifically look at issues of risk, exposure, local vulnerability, and then put that into the context of possible and real examples of impact. And then further to that, then to look at this idea of process indicators which say, well, how effective, how tailored, how appropriate and proportionate are the response measures actually in place. So that work has been going on for a couple of years through the work of people at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh and indeed in my own institution in the University of Dundee as part of the Climate Exchange with the James Hutton Institute. And I think we're making significant progress towards that. It initially took a kind of sectoral approach in terms of trying to look specifically at the levels of adaptive behaviour and response that were happening in each of the 12 sectors of the economy in the original framework. But actually, through dialogue with the policy teams, we've moved into looking much more thematically around the natural infrastructure and society framing of key themes that are coming through in the adaptation programme. So I think we've got a kind of prototype set of indicators in place. I think we're working closely with the adaptation subcommittee to try and make sure that these are the appropriate measures. And there's an ongoing issue about access to data and to make sure that we can get it in a timely fashion. And we obviously want to make it as parsimonious as possible. I think as light as possible makes for the most effective means by way of communication. So there's ongoing work. And I hope that we can we have a target to deliver the the indicators in the form of a kind of annualised report by the end of this year for the natural environment section, and then next year we move into looking at transport, infrastructure, the built environment.
Can I ask you if any of you would see budgetary implications? You used the word parsimonious. I'm not quite sure if you're using it in relation to budgetary constraints or in terms of
in terms of the simplicity of our communication,
right. Well,
I mean, which I've obviously not done in terms of that example.
Can I ask the further question then about budgetary implications for research and where you would see that going? What you know, not in numbers, but just in terms of, is there going to be a future need to have more research in these areas?
I would think it's the whole monitoring and evaluation kind of area is very dynamic at the moment. I mean, UKCIP this morning have launched a report that we've co-wrote with someone on monitoring and evaluation. It's a very live area so I think, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but it feels like there's no kind of, oh, this is how you do it sort of thing at the moment, where there are lots of people who've tried it. There are tools and models out there that people can use. So so I would say it would still be an area for ongoing research for some time.
As an academic, we always say we need more money for research. You would expect me to say that, but I think more resources will help deliver the right tools in the fastest amount of time. But there is a process of dialogue with David's group and with Kate's group in terms of international dialogue as well. So there's been discussions with Canada, Australia, Finland in terms of their approaches to indicators and monitoring. So I think we're homing in on what would be the right idea here, and I hope that we'll be able to deliver a useful.
Yeah, I would support that, but just to highlight, there are costs involved with developing indicators because of the fact that often the data isn't available in the sort of format that ideally you would want it to be in order to actually use it as an indicator. So we have found, again, in England, in developing the indicator that the committee will use in 2015 when we report to Westminster Parliament, that we have had to spend not huge, I mean, on the scale of things, not huge amounts of money, but there has been a cost involved in actually developing and populating the indicators that we've been looking to develop. And I envision that I'm sure there'll be a similar situation in Scotland. I just wanted to touch on the way that the draft programme has been set out with the 3 themes and the 9 objectives, which actually I think is very neat and very logically ordered. And I compare that to the England programme, which has 7 themes and 31 objectives and 374 individual actions. And I know that because I've been through all of them. And what I do like about the way that it's been set out in the draft Scotland programme is that it's clear and well ordered. So for each of the 3 themes, you have a similar objective around improving understanding of the effects of climate change, so research into impacts. And we could certainly do some evaluation there on just how effective research is being in understanding and improving our knowledge of impacts. Yeah, I think that there's, as I mentioned earlier, that even though the other objectives aren't always very outcome specific, there's still ways that we can take to monitor progress in whether they're being implemented and whether the programme itself is doing what it needs to do, which is to basically build resilience and enable resilience to be built in Scotland. I would say that there, and this is more a personal view, but there are 1 or 2 issues which or 1 or 2 climate threats, as it were, or which perhaps aren't immediately clear how they're being picked up. So I at the moment don't really see in the objectives, the way they've been set out, how issues around resilience of businesses and the whole issue around supply chains is coming out. And equally, the issue which we've touched on earlier as well around social vulnerability and equity issues. I'm presuming obviously that's within the society theme, but it just doesn't, at the moment, it's not completely clear how those threats and potential opportunities are being picked up.
I mean, through the convener briefly, I'm interested to hear you raising that, because I was actually going to ask you about it within the framework, the adaptation programme. It's actually on page 51, but there's communities, and then 52 is businesses, and it does seem quite thin in terms of the climate-ready society theme. in relation to communities or families on low income, and I don't really see very much about that in terms of resilience, although I was quite heartened by, was it your Green and Pleasant land in Scotland, and talking about that aspect. But it did concern me when looking at this that there doesn't seem to be a great deal of identification of that problem that some people might face. Is there any comment from the panel on that at all?
As I understand it, I think in the evolution of the adaptation programme, there was going to at one time be a separate section on economics and business, but I think that in terms of the process, that it didn't gain sufficient traction, and I think it's been folded, therefore, into the society. I similarly thought that the threats with respect to business could be developed more fully, and I think some of the social dimensions of environmental change and some of these vulnerability issues that you speak of with respect to communities and individuals, I think could similarly get a bit more weight and within a revised version.
Very good. I'd like to come back to a point that was made by David Thompson a little earlier there. And in the adaptation programme, we'd be wanting to make sure that we've got resilient, low-carbon power. And you made some remarks, and I didn't want to continue in detail at the time, about your concerns about the siting of renewable energy projects. What was that about?
Well, we looked at, again, in our 2011 report, we looked at the some of the sectors which are making decisions which are on a long time frame, and infrastructure generally, decisions around the siting and the design of infrastructure, and their associated networks, often are quite long-term decisions. I mean, some are more long-term than others. So, construction of a rail bridge is a 150-year time frame, whereas arguably perhaps ICT and even some forms of renewable energy aren't on the same sort of time scale, more like 20 or 30 years. But even so, we just didn't see. There wasn't a lot of it. It wasn't clear to us that those decisions that are being made around the siting and design of those of some types of infrastructure, like low carbon renewable energy and ICT, were explicitly considering how climate change may impact on where they are sited and the design of those assets. It just wasn't. We couldn't find a lot of evidence to suggest that decision-making process was considering the risk of climate change. Whereas in other sectors, as I mentioned, land use planning, building regulations, forestry, it was clear that the long-term climate impacts were being explicitly considered and accounted for.
I'm concerned about the siting issue. I mean, we talk about offshore wind, we're talking about onshore wind, talking about wave and tidal. Which particular ones were you?
Well, we didn't go into that level of specificity, but I mean, one of the problems is that the climate projections are quite uncertain. Well, they're all uncertain, as we've been talking about earlier, but they're even more uncertain when it comes to the implications for wind speed and to some degree forecasting the sort of magnitude and or predicting the magnitude and frequency of extreme weather events like storms. So it is perhaps harder than it is when you're thinking about other climate impacts to apply the projections in your long-term decision making. But even so, we didn't see any explicit evidence that that was even being considered in the first place. And it was just an issue that we raised in our report in 2011 that we just felt needed to be looked at in a bit more detail by Scottish Government and by the relevant actors, so Ofgem and others, just to see maybe to look in more depth than we were able to, and what was quite a high-level report, about whether those issues are being looked at in those decisions.
We'll reflect on that. Thank you very much. It's quite useful to have this round-table approach, and your evidence has been very valuable. We have a series of panels to welcome here before we write to the Minister about what we think about his adaptation programmes. And your work in that is very welcome. Thank you for your contributions. And the details of our next meeting is tomorrow, when we'll be hearing from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change on the draft budget. And at that point, I close this meeting formally.